A pregnant woman stands alone in the middle of Incheon International Airport while her husband, the most feared mafia boss in all of Seoul, watches immigration officers drag her toward the departure gate. She is carrying his child. He knows it, and he is letting her go anyway. Before they take her through security, she kneels down and places a single brass key on the cold airport floor between them. She looks at him one last time and says 7 words that will haunt him for the rest of his life. Stay until the end to find out what she said and what that key unlocked. If this story moves you, hit like and drop the name of the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. But the rain had been falling over Incheon for 3 hours before Amani Cross realized she had stopped feeling it. She stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of the International Departure Terminal, one hand pressed flat against the cold glass, the other resting below her belly where the weight had shifted in the last 2 weeks. Lower now, heavier, more insistent, as if the baby itself understood that something was ending. Outside, the runway lights bled gold and red through the downpour, streaking across the tarmac in long, trembling lines that looked like wounds. The planes beyond the glass moved slowly in the dark, massive and indifferent, heading toward cities that had no idea any of this was happening. Amani had traveled through this airport 11 times in the past 2 years. The first time, she had been terrified. A black woman from New Orleans arriving alone in Seoul with a rolled tube of architectural drawings under one arm and a contract she still half believed was a mistake. The last time before tonight, she had been returning from her mother's house in the Treme neighborhood with a wooden box of her grandmother's recipe cards and a bottle of hot sauce that customs had nearly confiscated. Seojun had been waiting for her at arrivals, holding a paper cup of coffee with her name written in his careful, slightly wrong English handwriting. He had mispronounced her name for 6 months before she gave up correcting him. By then it had become something private between them, the small, ordinary proof that he was trying. She didn't know what the 11th time would be remembered as until the immigration officers appeared at her hotel room door at 4 in the morning. There had been 2 of them, both young, both embarrassed in the particular way of people who have been ordered to do something they know is wrong but don't have the standing to refuse. They had shown her a document. Her hands had been shaking too badly to read the official Korean text, but the English summary at the bottom was clear enough. Withdrawal of marital sponsorship. Pending investigation. Voluntary departure required within 24 hours or formal detention would follow. She had asked them to wait in the hallway while she dressed. She had sat on the edge of the hotel bed for a long time after that, in the dark, with her hand on her stomach. The baby had moved, a slow, rolling pressure beneath her palm, more sensation than pain, the kind of movement that in other circumstances would have made her laugh out loud. She had not laughed. She had pressed her hand harder against her belly and breathed through her nose the way the doctor had taught her, slow counts in, longer counts out, until the shaking in her chest became manageable. Then she had picked up her phone and called Malachi. He answered on the second ring, which meant he hadn't been sleeping either. "They came," she said. A long silence. Then, "How long do you have?" "They're in the hallway." "Amani?" "I'm not calling for help." Her voice was steadier than she expected. "I'm calling because I need you to know where I put the recorder. The compartment under the west floor of the pavilion. The brass key opens it." "I know where it is. You told me 3 weeks ago." "I need to hear myself say it out loud." Another silence. She could hear him breathing, the specific quality of his breath when he was working very hard not to say something that would make things worse. "The baby," he started. "The baby is fine." A lie, or close enough to one. Her last appointment had been canceled. She didn't know if the baby was fine. She had to believe it because the alternative was something she could not afford to feel right now. "I need you to stay hidden until the evidence is secure. Whatever happens to me at that airport, you do not move until the evidence is secure. You understand me? You're asking me to let my pregnant sister get put on a plane. I'm asking you to finish what we started." Her voice cracked on the last word, just slightly. She pressed her fist against her mouth for a moment, then lowered it. "He signed the document, Malachi. He already signed it." The silence that followed was different from the ones before it. Heavier. Malachi Cross had spent 11 years as a financial crimes attorney watching powerful men destroy people they claimed to love, and even he needed a moment to absorb that particular piece of information. "Okay," he said finally. His voice had gone very quiet and very flat, the way it did when he was making a decision. "Okay, I'll wait. Thank you." "Don't thank me. Just keep your hand on your stomach and don't let them rush you. You walk at your own pace, you hear me?" She heard him. She walked at her own pace. The terminal was quieter than it should have been for midnight on a Thursday, or maybe it was the way shock organized perception, reducing the surrounding world to a series of disconnected details that her brain cataloged without context. A child sleeping across two chairs with a stuffed animal pressed against his face. A cleaning woman mopping the same section of floor in slow, methodical circles. The tinny sound of a flight announcement in Korean that she had learned enough of the language to partially understand. Delayed departure, gate change, weather advisory. The immigration officers walked on either side of her, not touching her, maintaining a careful distance that she understood was its own kind of performance. They were being filmed. Someone had tipped off at least 3 news outlets. She had seen the camera crews setting up near the departure gates when they entered the terminal, too many of them to be coincidence, too positioned to be anything other than planned. She had understood then that the humiliation had been the point from the beginning. She stopped walking when she saw him. Kang Seo-jun stood near the far wall of the departure hall with his hands at his sides and his jaw set in the particular rigid way she had learned meant he was experiencing an emotion he had no vocabulary for. He was wearing the charcoal suit he wore when he was performing authority, the one his tailor had made specifically to make him look immovable. It worked. He looked like something that had been poured into that spot and left to harden. Behind him, at a slight and careful distance, stood Baek Jin-woo, his enforcer, his most loyal captain, the only man in Seo-jun's entire organization who had ever once told him he was wrong. Jin-woo's face was doing something complicated that Amani couldn't fully read from across the terminal. And to Seo-jun's left, positioned with the precise, practiced casualness of a woman who had rehearsed this moment many times, stood Han Yura. Imani had known Han Yura for almost 2 years. She had watched her move through Seo-jun's world with the grace of someone who had been born understanding the architecture of power. How to be useful without appearing ambitious. How to be present without appearing threatening. How to make another woman feel the cold without ever visibly turning down the heat. Yura was wearing a navy coat that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, and her expression was arranged into something that approximated concern with the skill of a professional actress. Imani looked at her for exactly 1 second. Then she looked at Seo-jun. He met her eyes. He didn't look away. She had expected him to, had half prepared herself for the particular devastation of a man who couldn't hold her gaze after what he'd done. But he looked at her directly, and what she saw in his face was worse than guilt. It was certainty. He had convinced himself, whatever he had been shown, whatever story had been built around the photographs and the forged documents and the altered medical files, he had chosen to believe it because the alternative required him to trust her more than he trusted the evidence arranged in front of him. And Kang Seo-jun had spent 20 years in a world where evidence was the only currency that didn't lie. She had built him a different world. She had spent 18 months trying to show him what it felt like to live somewhere that wasn't a transaction. He had burned it down in a single night. Amani stopped walking when she was approximately 15 feet from him. The immigration officers stopped with her, uncertain, watching the space between the two of them with the wariness of people who understood they were standing inside something much larger than their jurisdiction. She reached into the pocket of her cream wool coat, soaked at the shoulders now, from the rain she'd walked through between the car and the terminal entrance, and closed her fingers around the brass key. She had found it 3 months ago, inside the sealed western wall of Woolrim House, tucked into a carved recess that hadn't been opened in decades. It was old. Genuinely old, the kind of object that carried history in its weight and patina. And it had taken her 2 weeks of research to understand what it unlocked. The hidden compartment beneath the pavilion floor had been built into the original structure, a feature of old Hanok architecture that served as both storage and sanctuary, a place where things of value could be kept away from eyes that couldn't be trusted. She had used it for that exact purpose. The key was warm from her body heat when she held it up. Seo-jun's eyes dropped to it. Something moved across his face, recognition, or the beginning of it, quickly suppressed. This opens the truth you were too proud to ask for, she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. The terminal's ambient noise, the distant sound of the rain, the low mechanical hum of the building's ventilation system, the careful breathing of the officers beside her, all of it seemed to recede, leaving her words hanging in a pocket of silence that felt enormous. Seo-jun said nothing. She walked forward until she was close enough that she could have reached out and touched his face if she had chosen to. She didn't. She crouched down, carefully, one hand braced against her knee, feeling the strain of the movement in her back and hips, and placed the brass key on the airport floor between them. She straightened up. She looked at him one last time. "When you discover whose child this is," she said, "don't come looking for the woman who begged you to believe her." She turned and walked toward the security gate without looking back. She counted her steps because it was the only way to keep moving. 17 steps to the checkpoint. She handed her documents to the officer without speaking. She heard, or felt, she wasn't certain which, the moment behind her when something shifted in the room's atmosphere, a change in the quality of the air that might have been the man she loved starting to move, or might have been nothing at all. She didn't turn around. The security gate closed behind her. What Imani Cross did not see, in the moment after she disappeared beyond the checkpoint, was Han Yura step forward from Seo-jun's left side, bend gracefully at the knee, and pick up the brass key from the airport floor. What Imani Cross also did not see was Baek Jin-woo, standing 4 steps behind his boss, watching Yura's hand close around the key with an expression on his face that was not uncertainty or surprise. It was recognition. 18 months earlier, the western wall of Walram House had nearly killed 3 construction workers. Not through any dramatic structural failure, no sudden collapse, no warning crack racing up ancient stone. It had been quieter than that, and therefore more dangerous. The crew chief had noticed a hairline fracture along the base of the wall at approximately 7 in the morning and dismissed it as surface settling, which was the kind of mistake experienced workers made when they were working on a deadline set by people who had never held a trowel. By 9 o'clock, 2 of his men had positioned an excavator against the wall's exterior face, following the demolition schedule that Seo-jun's project manager had approved 3 weeks earlier. At 9:17, Imani Cross arrived on site. She had been awake since 4. The flight from New Orleans to Seoul had been 14 hours with a layover in Tokyo, and she had spent most of it reviewing the architectural survey files on her laptop, cross-referencing the original Hanok construction records she'd sourced from the National Heritage Archive against the renovation plans Seo-jun's team had submitted to the city. The plans were competent. She would give them that. Whoever had drawn them understood modern construction methodology. What they didn't understand, what the survey files made obvious to anyone trained in pre-modern Korean structural systems, was that the western wall of Walram House was not a wall. It was a spine. The original structure had been built around a concealed load-bearing framework that ran inside the western wall's interior, a system of timber columns and horizontal beams that predated by almost a century the external stone cladding that made the wall look independent. Remove the stone facing and you remove the support that held the entire roof structure in tension. In practical terms, knock down the wall, and within 48 hours the main pavilion ceiling would begin to sag. Within a week it would come down. Imani had flagged this in the written report she'd submitted to Seo-jun's project manager 6 days before flying to Seoul. The project manager had not responded. She had called twice. No callback. She had arrived on site at 9:17 to find an excavator pressed against the wall and its bucket arm already raised. She had walked across the courtyard, positioned herself between the excavator and the wall, and unrolled her architectural plans. The operator had killed the engine. Confused. Nobody stood in front of excavators. It wasn't something people did. The crew chief had appeared from around the corner of the main building, taken one look at the situation, and begun speaking in rapid Korean that Imani's language skills, still in their early functional stage at that point, could only partially parse. She caught enough. She caught, "Who do you think you are? And we have authorization, and you are going to leave this site right now." "Show me the demolition permit," she said. The crew chief switched to English. "Who are you?" "I'm the restoration architect of record. Show me the demolition permit." "The permit is with project management." "Then call them." She kept her hands flat on the rolled plans, her feet planted, her voice level. Because what you're about to demolish is a load-bearing interior frame, not a decorative wall, an interior frame. And when that pavilion roof comes down and kills one of your workers, your demolition permit is not going to protect you. The crew chief looked at her for a long moment. He was in his mid-50s, weathered, built like a man who had been doing physical work his entire adult life. And he had the particular expression of someone who had been certain about something 5 seconds ago and was now less certain but was not willing to show it. "We have a schedule," he said. I know." She didn't break eye contact. "Call your project manager." The call happened. The project manager appeared on site 40 minutes later, during which time Imani had not moved from in front of the wall. Workers had gathered in ones and twos at the edges of the courtyard, watching with the tentative curiosity of people who had been told to stay back but were finding it difficult. The excavator operator had gotten down from his cab and was sitting on the machine's track, smoking a cigarette, with the posture of a man who had decided the situation was now above his pay grade. The project manager listened to the crew chief's account. He looked at Imani. He looked at her plans. "We submitted this to the city," he started. "The city approved the exterior renovation plan, not the demolition of load-bearing structures." She turned to the third page of the survey and tapped the cross-section diagram with her index finger. "See this? This is the interior frame. It's inside the western wall. Your survey missed it because the original timber was replaced with iron reinforcement during a repair in," she checked her notes, "1962. The iron doesn't show up on standard ground-penetrating radar at the frequency your survey used." The project manager studied the diagram. He was a professional. Whatever his feelings about being contradicted by a woman who had arrived from overseas 3 hours ago and immediately positioned herself in front of heavy machinery, he understood structural drawings. He looked at the crew chief. He said something in Korean. The crew chief did not look happy, but he nodded. The excavator did not move. Kang Seo-jun arrived at Woolram House at noon. Imani was still on site, working with 2 of the crew members to carefully remove a section of the wall's stone facing to expose what was underneath. When she heard the cars, 3 black vehicles, the kind of low-profile luxury fleet that somehow managed to be more conspicuous than something obviously expensive, she didn't stop what she was doing. She finished the section she was on, made a note in her site journal, and turned around. She had seen photographs of Kang Seo-jun. The initial contract paperwork had included a brief company profile with a photo that had clearly been taken by a professional who understood how to make powerful men look even more powerful. Good lighting, slight upward angle, the kind of composed expression that suggested absolute authority without requiring the subject to do anything dramatic. She had studied the photo in a clinical way and formed 2 opinions. He was younger than she expected for someone who controlled this much money, and he had the eyes of a person who had learned very early that showing emotion was a strategic disadvantage. In person, the eyes were the same. The rest of him was different from the photograph in small, significant ways. There was something in the way he held his jaw when he was angry that the photograph hadn't caught, a tightness that suggested he was very rarely as controlled as he appeared. He walked across the courtyard with 2 men behind him and his attention already on the wall, assessing the damage of the morning's delay in real time, performing a quick financial calculation that showed on his face as a species of cold fury. He looked at the excavator. He looked at the partially exposed wall. He looked at Imani. "You stopped my crew," he said. His English was precise and slightly formal, the kind learned from textbooks rather than conversation. "I stopped your crew from demolishing a load-bearing frame," she said. "When they finish removing the stone facing, you'll see it. I had a schedule." "I know. My investors, with respect," she said, and she meant the phrase as a transition, not an apology. "Your investors would be more upset if the main pavilion collapsed during construction. The liability alone would set the project back 18 months. He looked at her for a moment that was longer than a professional assessment required. She didn't look away. She had learned in 12 years of working construction sites, in New Orleans, in Atlanta, in 3 countries where she had been, at various points the only black woman in the room, that looking away in the first 30 seconds of an exchange like this one established a dynamic that was very difficult to correct afterward. "Show me," he said. She showed him. They stood side by side against the open section of wall while she traced the iron reinforcement frame with a flashlight, explaining the load distribution, the tension points, the relationship between the frame and the roof's central beam. He listened without interrupting, which was either the courtesy of a man who understood that he didn't know something, or the patience of someone calculating when to push back. She couldn't tell which yet. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "How long to work around it?" he asked. "If we redesign the east corridor connection, we can preserve the frame and still open the western face to the garden." She had already sketched the adjustment that morning during the 40-minute wait for the project manager. "Maybe 3 weeks added to the structural phase. Less if your crew is good. My crew is good." "Then 3 weeks." He looked at the wall again and something shifted in his expression. Not exactly softening, but a very slight release of the specific tension that had been there since he arrived. She recognized it. It was the expression of a man who had expected a fight and found something else instead. "What's your name?" he asked. "Amani Cross." He repeated it to himself under his breath, getting the sound of it. Then he looked at her directly. "You were right," he said. "My manager should have returned your calls." It was such a simple statement, such a straightforward acknowledgement of a fact. She had worked with men who had never in their professional lives said those 4 words to anyone, particularly not to a woman who had just spent an hour disrupting their construction schedule in front of their entire crew. Something about the simplicity of it caught her off guard. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me." He turned to walk back toward his cars. "Fix my wall, Ms. Cross." She fixed his wall, and in the 3 weeks that followed, something began between them that neither of them had planned and neither of them was equipped for. Not because they were incompatible, but because they were similar in the specific way that made intimacy feel like danger. Both of them had learned to operate in worlds that required them to be harder than they naturally were. Both of them had gotten very good at it, and now they were standing in the courtyard of an old house that smelled of wood smoke and stone, arguing about structural integrity and watching each other with the careful attention of people who were recognizing something they hadn't expected to find. Their arguments were daily. This was not a problem. They argued about the East Corridor redesign and about the sourcing of replacement timber, and about whether the persimmon tree in the center courtyard should be incorporated into the renovation design or worked around. Seo-jun wanted the tree worked around. It was a complication, an irregularity in what should be a clean, elegant floor plan. Amani wanted to build the entire project around the tree. "It's the oldest thing on this property," she said. "Your father planted it." "How do you know that?" She had done her research. She always did her research. The property records show the original tree was removed in the 1980s for a car garage. The one in the courtyard now was planted in 1994. "Your family bought this property in 1994. He was quiet for a moment. "He planted it the year my brother was born," he said. It was the first personal thing he had ever said to her. It came out with the slightly surprised quality of information that had been kept in a sealed room and opened by accident. She looked at the tree. It was mid-autumn. The persimmons were orange against the gray sky. "Then we build around it," she said. He didn't argue after that. The coffee started 2 weeks in. She arrived on site one morning to find a paper cup on top of her site journal with her name written on it in his handwriting. She recognized it from contract documents, in careful, slightly oversized letters. The coffee was from a cafe 3 blocks away that she had mentioned once in passing. She hadn't thought he was listening. She brought him a boxed lunch from the workers' lunch truck the following Thursday. He had been standing near his car with 2 of his men, and she had walked over and held the box out and said, "Sit with them," meaning the crew, with the directness of someone who had decided that this particular social performance was going to end. He had looked at the box. He had looked at her. Then he had taken it, walked to the lunch area, and sat down on a low concrete wall between a carpenter and a tile worker, and eaten his lunch without his men hovering over him. She had watched from across the courtyard and thought, there is a person inside this man that the world is not allowed to see. She had also thought, this is going to be more complicated than a wall. She was correct on both counts. By the time the structural phase of the Woolrim house renovation was complete, Kang Seo-jun had learned to make her mother's sweet potato pie badly, but sincerely, had sat through 4 phone calls with her brother Malachi, in which Malachi asked increasingly pointed questions about Seo-jun's business practices, and had told Amani 3 things he had never told another person: that he missed his father, that he was afraid of becoming the kind of man his father would not recognize, and that the persimmon tree had been the one thing his father left behind that the organization had never been able to use. Imani had listened to all three without trying to fix any of them. This was, she would later understand, the most important thing she ever did for him, and he had no language for how much it meant, so instead he had shown up consistently in the small practical ways that were available to him. The coffee. The calls returned within an hour. The moment he overheard one of his executives make a comment about her being foreign and immediately removed that executive from all contact with the project. Not dramatically, without announcement, just suddenly, the executive was no longer present. She had asked him about it. "He won't be a problem," Seo-jun said. "What did you do?" "Reassigned him." "To what?" "Somewhere he can be stupid without costing me money." She had almost laughed. She'd caught herself, but not quite. The corner of her mouth had moved, and he'd seen it, and something in his face had changed in a way that she didn't have a name for yet, something that looked like relief, or like a man discovering that warmth was still a thing he was capable of feeling. He followed her to New Orleans in December. He had never been south of Atlanta. He arrived in the Treme wearing a coat that was appropriate for Seoul in December and deeply wrong for Louisiana, where December was cold the way a comfortable room is cold. Manageable, honest, nothing like the thing the coat was built for. Loretta Cross noticed the coat within 30 seconds of meeting him. "Give me that," she said, taking it from him at the door. "You'll scare my neighbors." Seo-jun looked at Imani. "She means the coat is too formal," Imani said. "I understood," he said. Loretta Cross was 62 years old and had buried one husband and raised 2 children on a nurse's salary, while her neighborhood was rebuilt around her after a flood that had broken the city. She had opinions about powerful men. She had lived through enough of them, watched them make decisions from safe distances about places they'd never lived in. And she extended to Kang Seo-jun exactly the same welcome she extended to everyone who came through her door. A clean dish towel, a cutting board, and a pile of vegetables that needed washing. Seo-jun washed vegetables for 45 minutes without complaint. Malachi came for dinner. He was 3 years older than Imani, built like their father, with the specific combination of warmth and wariness that came from spending a decade watching money move through the cracks in legal systems. He and Seo-jun sat across from each other at the dinner table and had the kind of conversation that was not entirely about what it appeared to be about, discussing the Woolroom House project, the Seoul development market, the way historic preservation intersected with private capital, while also being, underneath all of it, a negotiation. Malachi was deciding whether Seo-jun was the kind of powerful man who consumed people or the kind who could be taught to protect them. Seo-jun was deciding whether Malachi was someone he needed to worry about. By the end of dinner, neither of them had fully resolved the question, but Malachi had refilled Seo-jun's glass twice, which Imani knew meant something. "You know what he does," Malachi said to her later in the kitchen while they washed dishes. "I know." "You know the whole thing, not just the development company." "I know," she said again. "And?" She was quiet for a moment, scrubbing a pot that didn't need scrubbing. "And he's trying to become something else. I don't know if he can, but he's trying." Malachi dried a glass very carefully. "Trying isn't the same as succeeding. I know that too." He handed her the glass. "If he hurts you, he won't." Imani. "Malachi." She set the pot down and looked at her brother. "I'm not asking for your permission. I'm telling you what's true. He is trying. That matters to me." Malachi looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, with the expression of a man filing information under a category he hoped he would never need to open again. Seo-jun proposed 3 months later, in the courtyard of Woolroom House, beneath the persimmon tree that his father had planted the year his brother was born. He didn't have a speech prepared. She had known him long enough by then to understand that he was not a man who rehearsed emotion. He either felt it or he didn't, and when he felt it, the expression was always slightly surprised, as if his own heart had done something without consulting him. He simply stood in front of her with a ring in his hand. Not a large ring, not the kind of ostentatious statement that his wealth could have easily produced, and said, "I don't know how to do this, but I know I want to." She had warned him. She had held the ring in her palm and looked at him seriously and said, "Loving me in private is going to be easy. Choosing me when your world judges me is going to be harder." He had looked at her with those contained, watchful eyes and said, "Then let them watch." She had believed him. For 12 months, she had every reason to. He shut down whispers from Seoul's social elite with the particular cold efficiency of a man who had spent 20 years ensuring that people who created problems for him regretted it. He sat through tabloid cycles that called Amani a foreign opportunist and responded with a level of public composure that she later learned had required him to remove 3 journalists from his organization's approved media list. He learned her mother's recipes, badly, consistently, with the sincere incompetence of a man who had never needed to cook anything and was doing it anyway because she had mentioned once that food was how her family showed love. He let Woolrim House become the one clean place inside his dirty empire. And then the empire began to crack. The first sign was the port disruption in late spring, a rival syndicate moving into Busan with money and connections that didn't match anything in the intelligence Seo Jun's organization had compiled. 3 shipping contracts fell through in 2 weeks. The loss was manageable by itself, but it happened at the same time as the surfacing of financial records from the Kang family's earliest dealings. Records that had been sealed, that should have stayed sealed, that appeared on a prosecutor's desk in a manner that suggested someone with access to the organization's private archives had been very deliberately providing information to someone outside it. The Kang board began asking questions. The questions led to conversations with Han Yura's family corporation. Han Yura came with those conversations. Imani had known about Yura before she appeared. Seo Jun had mentioned her once, briefly, as a former arrangement, the kind of thing that happened in his world between families with compatible interests. He had not described it as a relationship. He had described it as a negotiation that had been suspended when he decided to stop letting other people make his personal decisions. Imani had accepted this account at face value, because she trusted him, and because she understood that his past was his past. What she had not anticipated was Han Yura in person. Yura was not what Imani had imagined. She had imagined someone harder, someone whose ambition was visible, who showed her calculations. Yura was nothing like that. She was elegant and quiet, and she had the specific skill of being the most useful person in any room without ever appearing to try. She solved a creditor dispute in a single phone call that Seo Jun's lawyers had been wrestling with for 3 weeks. She smoothed a meeting with a violent partner that had been on the verge of becoming something worse. She remembered the names of everyone's children and assistants and used them correctly. She never said anything cruel about Imani. She did something much worse. She became necessary. And while she was becoming necessary, Imani discovered the invoices. She had been reviewing the Woolrim House restoration budget, a routine audit, the kind she did quarterly, and found discrepancies that at first looked like accounting errors. Duplicate line items, contractor fees paid to companies she couldn't locate in the project records. Shell companies, she realized eventually, after 3 nights of cross-referencing registration data. Millions of dollars moving through the restoration project and out the other side into accounts she couldn't trace. She called Malachi. He was already looking at the same pipeline from the overseas side. He had been tracking the movement of money through 3 jurisdictions for 6 months as part of a financial crimes investigation that had nothing, on the surface, to do with Kang Seo Jun, and then suddenly had everything to do with him. Someone inside Han Yura's organization is feeding evidence to authorities, Malachi told her. If they find out I'm the one connecting the dots, the source disappears. Or doesn't disappear. You understand what I'm saying? She understood. She did not tell Seo Jun. Not because she didn't trust him. She had told him difficult truths before, and he had heard them. But the invoices ran through his own organization. The shell companies had been registered with the signatures of people who worked inside the Kang syndicate. If she told him and the wrong person found out she knew, Malachi's investigation would collapse. Worse, if Seo Jun confronted the wrong person without the full picture, the money would move again and the evidence would vanish. She needed more time. She needed more time, and then she discovered she was pregnant. The joy of it arrived before the fear. That was the honest truth of it, the thing she held on to later when everything else had broken. For approximately 37 minutes after seeing the test result, sitting on the bathroom floor of Woolrim House at 6 in the morning with the tile cold beneath her, there had been nothing but joy. She had put both hands on her stomach and felt the strangeness of knowing something was beginning, something entirely separate from all of this. The money and the lies and the evidence she was hiding and the investigation she couldn't tell her husband about. Something small and entirely new that didn't know yet what world it had chosen to arrive in. Then the fear arrived, and it was extensive. She planned to tell him at their anniversary dinner. She ordered the food he never cooked for himself anymore. She set candles. She placed the ultrasound photograph inside a wooden box beside his plate, and she sat at the table and waited for him to come home. He came home an hour and 40 minutes late. He took a phone call from Yura in the entryway. He came into the dining room still thinking about whatever the call had contained, moving through the space without fully registering it. She could see him doing it, the way his eyes moved over the table without landing, the way his hands were slightly tense at his sides. He did not open the wooden box. He apologized for being late. He sat down. He ate. He talked about the port contracts, the board's position, a meeting he needed to take in Japan. He asked if she was feeling well. She said yes. He did not ask why there was a wooden box beside his plate, because his attention was not fully in the room, and she could not make herself say open it, because there was something in his distraction that told her this was not the right moment, that the thing she was about to give him deserved a version of him that was present to receive it. She put the wooden box in her studio. She told him the following evening, showing him the ultrasound photograph directly. She had decided, sitting in the studio with the box in her lap, that she was not going to perform the announcement. She was just going to tell him. He looked at the photograph. For a moment, one long, suspended moment that she would think about for months afterward. Everything that Kang Seojun had built around himself came apart. She watched it happen. The careful, controlled face opened. His hands, the hands that signed contracts and gave orders and had done things she didn't ask him to detail. Those hands were shaking when he pressed one of them gently against her stomach, and he lowered himself to his knees in front of her, slowly, like a man setting down something very heavy, and whispered the phrase he had learned from her mother. "I see your heart." She almost told him everything in that moment. The invoices, Malachi, the shell companies, the threat letters she had received 2 weeks earlier, unsigned, delivered to her studio, telling her that foreigners who asked too many questions about Korean business arrangements sometimes lost their ability to ask questions at all. She almost put all of it on the table, right there, in the warmth of that moment, because she was exhausted from carrying it alone, and because he was kneeling in front of her, and for 1 second the world felt like something they were in together. Then Yura's name appeared on his phone screen. He turned it face down, but the name had already been there. The moment had already shifted, just slightly, like a building that has been struck by something it was not designed to absorb. She didn't tell him. She put the story back inside herself and smiled at him and held his hand against her stomach and let him feel the reality of the thing beginning between them. 2 weeks later, the photographs appeared. Seojun's security team brought them to him on a Tuesday morning. Surveillance photographs, professionally done, showing Imani entering a hotel and being embraced in the lobby by a man in a dark jacket. The embrace looked intimate. The angle had been chosen carefully. The man's face was visible. Malachi's face. Her brother, whom Seojun had met once over a year ago at a dinner table in New Orleans, whom Seojun had apparently filed and not retained clearly enough to recognize in a photograph taken from 40 feet away at a deliberately chosen angle. Seojun asked her where she had been on the afternoon of the photograph. She lied. It was a small lie. She said she had been at the site office, reviewing contractor reports. And it was the worst mistake she made in the entire year that followed. Not because of what it was, but because of what Yura did with it. The lie became the crack. Everything that followed was built inside that crack. She didn't know yet about the forged fertility report. She didn't know about the bribed clinic administrator. She didn't know about the altered hotel records, the planted financial documents, the digital access credentials that had appeared in her studio's case files without her knowledge. She didn't know that a story had been built around her with extraordinary patience and precision, assembled piece by piece by someone who understood exactly how much evidence Kang Seojun needed to see before his pride would do the rest of the work. She found out the night he confronted her inside Woolram House. The documents were spread across the table in the main room, her restoration table, where she had laid out structural drawings for the past 18 months. Now it held something else: photographs, financial records, medical reports, a printed summary from an immigration compliance officer. She recognized the arrangement of it. It had been laid out for maximum effect, the way evidence was presented in a courtroom, the way a prosecutor organized material to guide a jury through a conclusion they had already decided was correct. Madame Kang was in the room. Seojun's mother sat at the far end of the table with her hands folded and her face arranged into an expression that Imani had learned over 18 months was the expression she wore when she had already won something. Seojun stood at the center of it. He looked at Imani when she came in, and what she saw in his face was something she had no word for. It was past anger, past suspicion, into something colder and more final, the expression of a man who had already built the verdict and was waiting for the sentencing. "Offer me a DNA test," she said immediately before he could speak. "Right now, tonight. Whatever lab you want." "That's not whatever lab you want, Seojun. I'll go tonight." "The report says—" "I know what the report says." She kept her voice level. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs. "It's wrong. I'm offering you the fastest way to prove it. Why won't you take it?" He looked at the photographs. "Why were you in that hotel?" She couldn't answer. Not without telling him about Malachi. Not without exposing the investigation that was still incomplete, still fragile, still the only thing standing between the truth and a set of very powerful people who wanted the truth buried. The silence stretched. Madam Kang's lawyer slid a document across the table. Seojun picked it up, read it, set it down. "Don't," Imani said. She heard something in her own voice that she didn't like. The beginning of something desperate, something she had promised herself she wouldn't allow. She made herself steady. "Seojun, an innocent person can still be destroyed when guilty people control the facts. You know that. You have spent 20 years knowing that." He looked at her. She looked back at him. She thought, he knows. Somewhere inside him, he knows. He picked up the pen. "Tell them," she said, as the immigration officers came through the door. "Tell them I'm carrying your child." Every person in the room went still. Seojun's face did something she had never seen it do before. It broke, just briefly, just for a fraction of a second, before the damage control arrived and sealed it shut again. "Whose child are you carrying?" he asked. The room was absolutely silent. Imani looked at the man she had married. She thought about the coffee cup with her name written on it. She thought about the kneeling, the trembling hand, the whispered words. She thought about all the things she had protected him from, quietly, without telling him, because she had believed, had genuinely, completely believed, that he would eventually trust her enough to ask the right questions. She had been wrong. "The child belongs to the man I married," she said, "but that man is no longer standing in front of me." Outside Woolroom House, the cameras were already waiting in the rain. The world watched Kang Seojun's pregnant black wife be escorted from the house she had restored with her own hands. At the airport, she placed the brass key on the floor between them. He let her go. And the moment the security gate closed behind her, three things began to happen simultaneously that Kang Seojun had no idea were already in motion. In a hotel room 2 kilometers from the airport, Malachi Cross opened his laptop and began compiling financial records he had been gathering for 7 months, waiting for the moment when his sister's safety no longer depended on his silence. In the parking structure beneath Incheon International Airport, Baek Jin-woo sat in his car with the engine off and his phone in his hand, replaying in his memory the exact motion of Han Yura's hand closing around the brass key, and then picking up his phone to call a contact at the Immigration Bureau who owed him a favor. And in the departure lounge beyond the security checkpoint, Imani Cross sat in a hard plastic airport chair with her hand pressed flat against her stomach, breathing slowly, counting the minutes until boarding, and thinking about a hidden compartment beneath the pavilion floor of Woolroom House and a digital recorder inside it and a voice preserved on it that was going to have to be enough. She had done everything she could do. Now she needed to survive the flight. The plane took off at 2:47 in the morning. Imani knew the exact time because she had been watching the clock on the seatback screen in front of her since they boarded, tracking the minutes the way a person tracks something they cannot stop but need to witness. The cabin was mostly dark. The passenger beside her, a Korean businessman in his 60s who had fallen asleep before the doors closed, was breathing in the slow, undisturbed rhythm of someone who had no idea what was sitting next to him. Imani kept her hand on her stomach and her eyes on the window and watched the lights of Incheon drop away beneath the clouds until there was nothing left to see. She did not cry on the plane. She had made a decision about that somewhere between the security gate and the boarding bridge. A quiet, practical decision, The kind she made on construction sites when something went wrong and the crew was watching to see how she would respond. Crying was not a strategy. Crying in an airplane seat at 3 in the morning, 30 weeks pregnant, being expelled from the country where she had spent the last 18 months building something she believed in. Crying would not protect the evidence in the pavilion floor, would not keep Malachi's identity hidden for the additional time he needed, would not change the fact that Kang Seojun had picked up a pen and signed his name on a document that turned her into a problem to be managed. So she didn't cry. She pressed her hand against her belly and felt the baby move. A slow, lateral shift, like a fish turning in still water. And she breathed through her nose, 4 counts in, 6 counts out. And she thought very carefully about what happened next. What happened next was New Orleans. Her mother's house. Her own bed, probably still with the quilt her grandmother had made from her grandfather's old work shirts. Malachi would be there within 48 hours. Her doctor's number was in her phone. She had money in her own accounts. She had always kept her own accounts, had insisted on it from the beginning, which Seojun had initially interpreted as distrust, and which she had explained was simply the condition of being a person who had learned early that financial independence was not a luxury, but a form of survival. She was going to be all right. She repeated this to herself with the same methodical steadiness she had used to get through the terminal, through security, through boarding. She was going to be all right. The baby was going to be all right. The evidence was secured. Malachi knew where it was. The recorder had captured everything. She almost believed it by the time they crossed the coastline and the sea opened up beneath them, dark and enormous and completely indifferent. At 3:15 in the morning, Baek Jin-woo was still sitting in the parking structure beneath Incheon International Airport. He had not started the car. He sat with his hands loose in his lap and his phone face up on the passenger seat and thought about the specific angle of Han Yura's body when she bent to pick up the brass key. The speed of it, the decision already made before the key had finished sliding across the airport floor. The way her fingers had closed around it and her hand had come back to her side in a single, practiced motion. The whole thing had taken perhaps 2 seconds. It had the quality of a movement rehearsed, or at minimum anticipated. Jin-woo had worked for Kang Seo-jun for 11 years. In those 11 years, he had performed a very specific function. He was the man Seo-jun sent when a situation required someone who could read it accurately and respond without flinching. He had done this in ports and boardrooms, and twice in locations he would not describe to anyone. He was good at it because he paid attention to the things that most people's attention slid past. The small, quick movements, the micro-expressions. The moment when someone's body did something their face was trying to contradict. Yura's body had moved before her mind had decided to move it. That was the thing he kept returning to. He picked up his phone and called the one contact at the Immigration Bureau who had been useful to him before. A senior officer who had, on 2 previous occasions, provided information about document filings in exchange for considerations that Jin-woo never named and the officer never acknowledged. The phone rang 4 times before the man picked up. "It's late," the officer said. "I need to know who filed the immigration complaint against Kang Imani," Jin-woo said. "Not the name on the document, the person who originated it." A long pause. "That's not... I know it's not. Can you find it?" Another pause. Longer. Jin-woo waited. He was very good at waiting. "Give me until morning," the officer said finally. "Thank you." He ended the call and sat in the dark for another few minutes, turning over what he knew and what he suspected and what he was not yet ready to say out loud, even to himself. Then he started the car and drove back toward Seoul, and the whole way there he thought about the fact that he had warned Seo-jun, had said it directly, in plain language, 3 weeks ago. Ask your wife. He had said it. He had looked at the man he had followed into rooms where both of them might not have come back out, and said, "Before you do anything else, ask her directly." Seo-jun had looked at him with those sealed, careful eyes and said, "I already know what she'll say." Jin-woo had wanted to grab him by the collar. He hadn't, because that was not his role, and because Seo-jun was not a man who received that kind of intervention well, and because he had told himself that there was still time, that Seo-jun would pull back from the edge before the thing became permanent. He had been wrong. The edge had come faster than either of them had anticipated, and the document was signed, and Imani Cross was somewhere over the Yellow Sea, and Kang Seo-jun was sitting inside Woolroom House, making a mistake he had no idea, yet was a mistake. Jinwoo drove back to Seoul and did not sleep. Seo-jun sat in the main room of Wolrim House until dawn. Everyone else had left. His mother, the lawyer, the immigration officers, the journalists outside the gates who had eventually run out of things to photograph and dispersed into the rain. The house was empty and very quiet. The candles Amani had set at the dinner table 3 weeks ago were still on the windowsill where she had moved them. He hadn't touched them, had walked past them daily without registering what they meant, and now he sat at the far end of the room and looked at them and felt the specific variety of stillness that arrived when a very loud thing had suddenly stopped. The evidence was still spread across the table. He looked at it without touching it. He was not at this moment thinking about whether it was real. He had thought about that already, had run the loop multiple times, the photographs, the fertility report, the financial records, the access credentials, had examined each piece individually and in combination and arrived at the same conclusion each time. The conclusion was internally consistent. The evidence supported itself. What he was thinking about, in the specific silence of 4 a.m. with the rain still streaking the glass, was the way Amani had looked at him when she said the child belongs to the man I married. But that man is no longer standing in front of me. He was thinking about the way her face had gone calm, not the calm of innocence performing itself for an audience. Something else. The calm of a person who had understood something fully and finally, and was no longer spending energy on the hope that it would be different. He had seen that expression before, in interrogation rooms, on the faces of men who had accepted what was coming. It was the expression of someone who had stopped fighting the moment, not because they had lost the will to fight, but because the fight had become irrelevant. He stood up. He walked to the window and stood looking out at the Wolrim House courtyard, at the persimmon tree that his father had planted the year his brother was born. The persimmons were gone now. The season was wrong. The tree was bare. And in the pre-dawn dark, it looked like something drawn in charcoal against the slightly lighter gray of the sky. His phone rang. He looked at it. Jinwoo. "It's 4 a.m, he said. "I know." Jinwoo's voice had a quality Seo-jun recognized, the flat, careful tone the man used when he was telling you something he already knew you weren't going to want to hear. "The man in the hotel photograph. I have an ID." Seo-jun's jaw tightened. "I know who he is." "No," Jinwoo said, "you don't." A silence. The hotel receptionist remembered something. She heard Amani use a name, not a full name, a nickname, something she would only use with someone she'd known since childhood. A pause. "There's a receipt, signed. The name is Malachi Cross." The name hit Seo-jun somewhere in the chest, not because he recognized it immediately, but because he almost recognized it. The almost recognition being the specific sensation of information that was present somewhere in his memory and refusing to come forward cleanly. "Who is Malachi Cross?" he asked. Jinwoo was quiet for one long, deliberate second. "He's her brother, Seo-jun." The room did not change. The rain did not change. The tree in the courtyard did not change. Everything was exactly as it had been 30 seconds ago. "You met him," Jinwoo continued, his voice still flat and careful. "New Orleans. 14 months ago. Dinner at her mother's house. He's an attorney. Financial crimes." Seo-jun put one hand on the window glass. He did not say anything. "I'm coming to the house," Jinwoo said. Jinwoo arrived at Wolrim House 40 minutes later as the sky was beginning to lighten from black to a dark, diluted gray. He came alone, which meant he had something to say that he did not want anyone else to hear. Seo-jun was in the courtyard when Jinwoo walked through the gate, standing near the persimmon tree, not touching it, just standing near it, the way a person stood near something they needed to be close to without knowing exactly why. Jinwoo stopped a few feet away and looked at his boss with an expression that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but occupied the territory between them. "Say it," Seo-jun said. "I warned you." "I know." "I said ask her directly. I said don't make a move until you've asked her directly." "I know what you said." "And you looked at me." Jinwoo stopped. He breathed out through his nose. His jaw was tight. "You looked at me like I was the one who didn't understand the situation, like I was being naive." Seo-jun said nothing. "She's 30 weeks pregnant and you put her on a plane in the middle of the night," Jinwoo said. The flatness in his voice had developed an edge now. He was not a man who raised his voice. In 11 years, Seojun had never heard him shout, but the edge was there, controlled and precise and cutting. Her brother is a financial crimes attorney. If he was meeting her in that hotel, it wasn't for what the photograph suggested. He was working something. What was he working? I don't know yet. But the fact that she lied about being there, Jinwoo paused. She didn't lie because she was hiding a relationship. She lied because she was protecting something she couldn't expose yet. That's a different category of lie. Seojun turned away from the tree and walked to the low stone bench at the courtyard's edge and sat down. He looked at the ground between his feet. He was still in the charcoal suit from the airport. He had not changed, had not considered changing, had been operating since midnight in the specific forward momentum of a man who needed to keep moving to avoid examining the thing he had done. He was no longer moving. The thing was there now, fully present. The fertility report, he said. I've been thinking about that. It was from my clinic, the same clinic I've used for 10 years. I know which clinic it was from. Jinwoo sat down on the opposite end of the bench. What I want to know is whether you have the original filing, not the copy they sent for the immigration case. The original consultation record. Seojun looked up. Because if the conclusion of that report was altered, Jinwoo met his eyes steadily, then someone had access to your private medical history, and the number of people who have that access is very small. The courtyard was silent except for the last of the rain, which had thinned to a fine mist that caught in the courtyard lights and made the air look lit from within. Seojun sat with this information and felt it reorganize something inside him, not quickly, not cleanly, but with the slow, irreversible quality of a structure beginning to shift under load. Get me the original, he said, first thing this morning, and find out who originated the immigration complaint, not the attorney of record, who originated it. I'm already working on that. Seojun looked at the tree. Where is she now? Still in the air. She lands in Houston in... Jinwoo checked his phone. 9 hours. Connection to New Orleans after that. Seojun was quiet. She placed the key on the floor, he said. Not a question. Not quite a statement either. More like a man reading aloud from something in order to understand it. I saw. And Yura picked it up. The silence that followed was different from the ones before it. Jinwoo's face shifted. Very slightly, the way his face always shifted when he was deciding how much of his thinking to make visible. I watched her pick it up, he said carefully. Her hand was moving before the key stopped sliding. Seojun looked at him. She was ready for it, Jinwoo said. She knew it was coming. Han-Yura's apartment was in Gangnam, on the 14th floor of a building that had been designed to look expensive without announcing it, the architectural equivalent of the woman herself. She arrived home from the airport at 4:30 in the morning, removed her navy coat, poured herself a glass of water, and sat at her kitchen counter with the brass key on the marble in front of her. She had taken it on instinct, or that was the story she told herself, which was not the same as the truth. The truth was that she had known about the key for 6 days, had known that Imani used an antique key as her site access token for the Woolroom House restoration, had known it carried some significance that went beyond the practical, had been watching for the moment Imani would use it as a communication. When Imani had produced it at the airport and placed it on the floor between herself and Seojun, Yura had understood immediately what it meant. A message, directed at Seojun, pointing at something Imani had hidden. Whatever was inside that lock was dangerous to Yura. She turned the key over in her fingers, examining it with the attention of someone trying to reverse engineer a conclusion. It was old, genuinely old, not decorative, with the specific patina of brass that had been handled regularly and then stored in a dry environment. The teeth were simple, the kind that corresponded to old interior locks rather than external security hardware. Something inside a building. Something inside Woolroom House specifically, probably, given the way Imani had held it. Yura thought about this. She thought about the restoration project, about the months she had spent building a detailed picture of Imani's work habits, access patterns, the specific areas of Woolroom House that Imani treated as her personal domain. The pavilion, the western face, the courtyard. Imani had been possessive of the pavilion specifically, had shooed contractors out of it on multiple occasions. had done much of the finish work there herself rather than delegating. The pavilion floor. Yura set the key down on the counter. She picked up her phone and called her financial director. He answered on the third ring, groggy, immediately alert when he heard her voice. "What's wrong?" "Nothing yet?" Her voice was perfectly composed. It was always perfectly composed. "I need you to have someone at Woolrim House by 6 this morning. The pavilion. Old construction, probably a hidden compartment beneath the floor structure." She paused. "Find it before anyone else does." "That's—" He stopped. She could hear him doing the calculation. "That's still Kang property. We have a security consultation contract that gives us site access for the merger evaluation." She had made sure of that 3 months ago. "Use it quietly before the restoration crew arrives." A pause. "What are we looking for?" "I'll know it when you describe it to me." She ended the call. She sat for a moment with her hand on the key, very still, in the particular stillness of a person running probability assessments at 4:30 in the morning. Then she placed the key in the drawer beneath the kitchen counter, not hidden, simply stored, and went to shower and prepare for the day ahead. She had a 7 o'clock breakfast meeting with 2 Kang Syndicate board members who were very concerned about the organization's recent instability and very interested in the stabilizing potential of the Han family merger. She needed to be composed. She needed to be useful. She needed to be, as she had been for the past 8 months, the most reliable person in any room she entered. She was very good at this. She had been very good at this since the age of 19, when she had first understood that intelligence and patience and the willingness to play a long game were worth more, in the world she operated in, than almost any other combination of qualities. She had waited a long time for this particular position. She was not going to let a brass key undo it. Jet. The call from Dr. Yoon Ha-rin came at 6:47 in the morning, while Seo-jun was in the Woolrim House bathroom splashing cold water on a face that felt like it belonged to someone else. He almost didn't answer. He looked at the name on the screen, Dr. Yoon, O.B., and for a moment didn't understand why Imani's obstetrician would be calling his number. Then he remembered that Imani had added him as the emergency contact at the first prenatal appointment 7 months ago, at a time when the world was different. He answered, "Mr. Kang." The doctor's voice was professional and carefully neutral, the voice of someone managing a difficult conversation with a person whose emotional state she was uncertain about. "I'm calling because your wife missed an emergency follow-up appointment last night. I've been unable to reach her directly. I wanted to ensure she's on a flight," he said. His voice came out flat. "She left Korea last night." A pause. "I see." A different quality in the silence now. "Mr. Kang, I need to ask you whether she was cleared for long-distance travel. Her case has been high risk since week 22. Something moved through Seo-jun's chest. He didn't have a name for it yet. High risk. "The placenta has been positioning low throughout the 3rd trimester. We've been monitoring it closely. Extended travel, particularly intercontinental, combined with significant physical or emotional stress, can precipitate complications." Her voice was still professional, still careful. "We had an appointment scheduled specifically because of some measurements I wanted to verify before she entered the final trimester. She missed it." "What kind of complications?" The doctor paused again. She was choosing her words. He recognized the behavior of these. It was the behavior of a professional who had learned that the way information was delivered could determine how it was received. "In the most serious cases," she said, early placental separation, internal bleeding, the baby's oxygen supply can be compromised very quickly. We would be talking about an emergency delivery situation." Seo-jun's hand tightened on the phone. "She's been managing extremely well," the doctor continued. "She's been careful, attentive, very committed to the monitoring schedule, which is why the missed appointment concerned me. It's not characteristic." She paused. "Is there a reason she left Korea unexpectedly?" He did not answer this. "Mr. Kang." The doctor's voice shifted, still professional, but with something firmer underneath it now, the tone of a person who had decided that professional courtesy had reached its limit. "I've been treating your wife for 7 months. Whatever is happening between the two of you personally, and I'm not asking you to explain it, your wife is 30 weeks pregnant with a high-risk placental position. She is on a 14-hour flight, and she is, I suspect, under significant emotional distress. I'm telling you this because you are listed as her emergency contact. That is my only reason for calling. Is she going to be all right? His voice had dropped to something almost inaudible. I don't know, the doctor said. And the honesty of it, the simple, unhedged honesty, was worse than any clinical language she could have used. I would feel better if she were not on that plane. She ended the call. Seojun stood at the bathroom sink with the phone in his hand and the water still running cold from the tap and looked at himself in the mirror. He looked like a man who had made an irreversible decision and was only now beginning to understand what irreversible meant. He turned off the tap. He went back to the main room and picked up the fertility report from the table. The document that had been the center of the evidence, the piece that had broken the last of his certainty about Imani, and took it to the window where the morning light was coming in gray and thin through the rain-streaked glass. He read it again. He read it slowly this time, not for conclusion, but for construction. The way he read contracts he suspected of containing something buried. He was looking at the language of it, the formatting, the specific way the clinical data was presented. He had read his original fertility consultation report 12 years ago. He remembered it the way he remembered most things that had mattered, not in detail, but in texture. The feeling of the document, the particular way the conclusions had been worded. This was not that texture. The conclusions in this document were definitive in a way that medical language rarely was. There was a certainty in the phrasing that he now recognized, reading it with clear eyes and a cold stomach, as the certainty of a document written backward, written from its conclusion toward its evidence rather than the other way around. His phone buzzed. Jin Woo. Immigration complaint originated from the office of Kang Family Legal Counsel, filed under Madam Kang's authorization code. Seojun read the message. He read it again. He set the fertility report on the windowsill and stood very still with the morning light coming in around it, and thought about his mother sitting at the end of the table last night, with her hands folded and her face arranged into the expression of a woman who had already won something. He thought about Imani's voice. An innocent person can still be destroyed when guilty people control the facts. He thought about the doctor's voice. I don't know. He picked up his phone and called Jin Woo. Get me into the clinic before they open, he said. I need the original file, not the consultation summary, the raw examination record with the imaging. I'll make a call. And Jin Woo. He stopped. His voice was doing something he didn't fully have control over. Find out if Yura's team has been anywhere near Wolram House in the last 24 hours. A beat of silence. I'll find out, Jin Woo said. Seojun ended the call. He stood at the window of the house his wife had restored and looked at the persimmon tree in the courtyard, bare in the early morning gray, and felt something he had not felt since he was a very young man learning, for the first time, that the people closest to him were capable of betrayal. The difference was that this time, the betrayal had not come from where he expected. This time, he had been the instrument of it. He pressed his fist against the window glass, hard enough that the cold of it traveled up his arm, and he stood there without moving while the full weight of the last 18 months reorganized itself inside him. Every moment he had trusted the evidence over the woman. Every moment he had let his mother's presence in the room influence what he chose to see. Every moment he had picked up the phone when Yura called instead of staying in the room with his wife. And he understood, standing there in this gray morning with his hand against the cold glass, that he had not been deceived only by forged documents and planted evidence. He had been deceived by his own pride, which had been older and more practiced than any forgery. His phone rang again. The number was unfamiliar, a New Orleans area code. He answered, Mr. Kang. The voice on the other end was not panicked, but it had the controlled quality of someone managing panic through sheer professional discipline. My name is Dr. Sandra Okafor. I'm the attending physician at University Medical Center in New Orleans. A pause. Imani Cross listed you as her emergency contact. She was brought in by ambulance approximately 20 minutes ago. The world went very quiet. She's in emergency surgery, the doctor said. I need to know her full medical history as quickly as possible. Seojun's hand tightened on the phone until the casing creaked. How bad? He said. Mr. Kang, I need her medical history. How bad is she? A half-second pause. The doctor made a decision. Placental abruption. Significant internal bleeding. She's in surgery now. The baby has been delivered by emergency cesarean. Her voice was measured and fast, the cadence of someone who had learned to compress catastrophic information into the smallest possible container. The infant is in the NICU. She's premature. We're doing everything we can. But I need to know about any underlying conditions, any medications, any complications from her prenatal care that aren't in the records we pulled. Oscaramji Ashait Jot. Seojun was already moving through the house. He gave the doctor everything he knew. The clinic name in Seoul, Dr. Yoon Ha-rin's direct number, the placental positioning issue, the missed appointment. His voice was steady. His hands were not. He was in the courtyard now, walking toward the gate, and the morning air was cold and wet against his face, and he registered none of it. Mr. Kang, the doctor's voice shifted slightly. Are you able to come to New Orleans? I'm leaving tonight, he said. The surgery will take several hours. She won't be conscious for... I'm leaving tonight. He ended the call and stood at the gate of Woolroom House with the phone in his hand and the gray morning light pressing down on everything, and for approximately 4 seconds he did not move at all. Then he called Jin Woo. Get me a flight. Tonight. New Orleans. His voice had the quality of something compressed past its normal state. Flat, dense, no space in it for anything that wasn't the next necessary thing. And I need you at the clinic in 2 hours. Don't go without me. What happened? She's in surgery. He paused. The word felt wrong in his mouth, too small for what it contained. The baby came early. Jinwoo was quiet for 1 second. I'll have a car at the house in 20 minutes. Seojun put his phone in his pocket and looked at the persimmon tree one more time. Then he went inside to change his clothes, because the charcoal suit was the suit he wore when he was performing authority, and he was done performing. The medical clinic occupied the 3rd floor of a building in Gangnam that presented itself as a private wellness center, the kind of facility that catered to people who required absolute discretion about their health and could afford to pay for it. Seojun had been a patient here for 12 years. The director, Dr. Choi Min-seok, was a small, precise man in his late 50s who had the manner of someone accustomed to powerful clients and had learned over many years that the best way to remain useful to them was to be unambiguously honest about medical facts while remaining carefully neutral about everything else. He met Seojun and Jinwoo in his private office at 7:45 in the morning, before regular clinic hours, at Jinwoo's request. He was visibly uneasy. Seojun noticed it the moment he walked in, the specific quality of unease that was different from the ordinary nervousness of being summoned early by an important client. This was something older, something that had been sitting with the man for a while. I need the original file, Seojun said, without sitting down. Not the consultation summary, the raw examination record from my initial fertility assessment, with the imaging. Dr. Choi looked at him. Mr. Kang, the original file. Dr. Choi opened his mouth, closed it, and then did something Seojun had not expected. He looked away. Just briefly. Just for a second. His eyes moved to the window and came back, and in that movement Seojun read everything he needed to know before the man said a word. Get it, Seojun said quietly. The quiet was worse than volume would have been, and Dr. Choi clearly understood this, because he reached immediately for his computer. The file took 3 minutes to pull. Dr. Choi printed the original consultation record, 12 years old, the paper slightly yellowed at the edges, and placed it on the desk between them. Then he printed the document that had been submitted as part of the immigration case evidence. He placed it beside the original. Seojun looked at both of them. Jinwoo leaned forward. The difference was not subtle. Seojun had been hoping for something ambiguous, something that could be explained by clerical error or documentation protocol, something that would give him a version of events that didn't require him to confront the full architecture of what had been done. What he found instead was categorical. The original record concluded in clear clinical language that his fertility was within normal parameters for his age with no significant impairment indicators. The document submitted as evidence concluded the opposite, had been constructed, he could see now with cold clarity, to appear like the original while replacing its substance entirely. Different font spacing. The clinic's letterhead reproduced, but the registration number 1 digit off. in a position where a person reading under stress would not catch it. How long have you known this was altered? Seo-jun asked. Dr. Choi did not answer immediately. How long? Seo-jun said. I was contacted 6 weeks ago. Dr. Choi's voice had shrunk considerably. He was looking at the desk rather than at Seo-jun. Someone with access to your account. They came in with proper authorization codes, staff-level credentials, and requested the original file for what was described as an internal audit. I was told it had been approved by your office. It had not been approved by my office. I know that now. Who came in? A woman. I don't know her name. She had credentials. He finally looked up. His face had the particular look of a man who had been telling himself a comfortable story and was watching it disassemble. I should have verified with you directly. I understand that. The authorization appeared legitimate, and Who gave you the authorization code? I don't know. It came through the system. Seo-jun picked up both documents from the desk. He stood looking at them for a moment, not reading them. He had read them. He was simply holding them, the way a person held something while they absorbed what it meant to hold it. Someone inside this clinic accessed my private records and falsified them to make it appear that I could not father a child, he said. His voice was perfectly level. And you did not contact me. The authorization, you did not contact me. Dr. Choi had no answer to this that would survive examination, and he knew it. Jinwoo straightened up from beside the desk and looked at Seo-jun with an expression that had moved past its earlier controlled quality into something raw. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. The document in Seo-jun's hand was the confirmation of what Jinwoo had been afraid of since the moment he watched Yura pick up the brass key at the airport. Confirmation that the evidence against Amani had not been assembled from available facts, but had been manufactured, piece by piece, by someone who had access to systems and people that only a very small number of individuals could reach. Seo-jun set the documents down on the desk. You'll provide a full written statement about this access, he said to Dr. Choi. Everything you remember, the woman's physical description, the date, the authorization code she used, everything. He picked up both documents. I'm taking these. Dr. Choi nodded. He looked like a man who had aged several years in the past 15 minutes and understood he had earned every one of them. The boardroom of the Kang Syndicate's executive headquarters was on the 22nd floor of a building in central Seoul that the legitimate side of the organization used as its development company offices. By 9:30 in the morning, 6 of the 8 board directors were already seated around the long conference table, responding to a summons that Jinwoo had sent in Seo-jun's name 40 minutes earlier. The summons had said only, emergency session, mandatory attendance, no staff. The directors had come because they always came when the summons said mandatory. They sat now with the cautious, watchful energy of powerful men who had learned that emergency sessions meant either opportunity or exposure, and had not yet determined which category this one belonged to. Han Yura was seated to the right of the head chair, where she had positioned herself over the past several months with the gradual, unremarkable precision of water finding its level. She was in a gray blazer this morning, her hair pulled back, a tablet and a leather portfolio in front of her. She looked exactly as composed as she always looked. Seo-jun walked in and closed the boardroom door behind him. He did not sit down. He placed the 2 medical documents on the table, the original and the forgery, side by side, and let the directors look at them without explanation. He waited, watching faces, reading the room the way he had been reading rooms since he was 19 years old, and learning from his father that the most important information in any negotiation was not what people said, but what their bodies did when they were surprised. 3 directors leaned forward to examine the documents. 2 exchanged a glance. One looked immediately at Yura. Yura looked at the documents. She looked at them with the appropriate expression. Concentration, then concern, then a slight furrowing of the brow that suggested she was processing something troubling. It was a very good performance. Seo-jun had spent 8 months watching her perform and had not recognized it as performance, which was the most precise measurement of how good she was. He recognized it now. These are my personal medical records, he said. The one on the left is the original from 12 years ago. The one on the right was submitted as evidence in the immigration case against my wife. He paused. They are not the same document. The room was quiet. Someone accessed my private medical history, altered the clinical conclusion, and submitted the forgery to immigration authorities as part of a fraud case against Imani. His voice was still level. He had made a deliberate choice about tone. Not the cold fury that was his natural register in confrontational moments, but something quieter. Something that he had observed in his father's manner on the few occasions when his father had been genuinely dangerous rather than performing danger. That document was the primary evidence used to suggest that the child my wife is carrying could not be mine. A director at the far end of the table, Park, the eldest of them, who had been with the Kang organization since Seojun's father's time, cleared his throat. Who had access to your medical records? That's what we're going to establish today. Seojun finally pulled out the chair at the head of the table and sat down. He looked at each director in turn, moving around the table slowly, the way his father had taught him to look at a room. Not a sweep, not a performance of authority, but actual individual examination, person by person, making each person understand they were being seen specifically. I'm also going to establish who filed the original immigration complaint against my wife, and who authorized the financial records that were planted in her studio. Another director, Kim, the youngest of them, whose family money was newer and whose nerves showed more visibly, shifted in his seat. You're saying the evidence was fabricated. I'm saying the evidence was manufactured by someone inside this organization, with help from outside it, over a period of months. Seojun placed his hands flat on the table. And I'm saying that person is in this room. The silence that followed had a different quality from the silences before it. It was not the silence of people waiting for information. It was the silence of people recalibrating, assessing exits, assessing exposure, determining whether their own position was stable or whether they needed to begin, very quietly, separating themselves from something. Yura spoke first. Seojun. Her voice was exactly right, concerned, careful, with precisely the right degree of sorrow in it. I understand you're in a very painful moment, but these are serious accusations. If someone falsified evidence, we should bring in investigators. We will. He looked at her, starting with the brass key. A very small thing happened in Yura's face. So small that most people in the room would not have caught it. It was not guilt. She was too practiced for guilt to show directly. But it was the micro-expression that preceded the decision to manage a situation, the face of a chess player registering an unexpected move. It lasted perhaps a third of a second. Jin-woo, standing near the door, saw it. Seojun saw it. My wife placed a key on the airport floor when she was being escorted to her departure gate, Seojun said. That key was directed at me. It was not directed at anyone else in that terminal. He paused. I'd like to know what happened to it. I don't know what you're referring to, Yura said. Jin-woo walked forward from the door and placed the antique brass key on the conference table. I watched you pick this up, he said. His voice was quiet and absolute. At the airport, I was 4 steps behind Mr. Kang. I watched your hand close around it before the key had stopped sliding. Yura looked at the key. She looked at Jin-woo. Her expression was still composed, but the composition was working harder now, visible in the slight set of her shoulders, the way her hands remained perfectly still on the table with the deliberate stillness of someone who had decided not to let them move. I picked it up, she said. I didn't know what it was. It seemed... Where is it now? Seojun asked. A beat. I must have she started. Jin-woo set a second item on the table beside the key, a photograph printed on standard copy paper showing the interior of a desk drawer. Inside the drawer, clearly visible, was the antique brass key lying beside what appeared to be merger documentation. Your private office, Jin-woo said. This morning, 6:45. The boardroom had gone completely still. Yura looked at the photograph. She was silent for 3 seconds. Then, I forgot I had it. You don't forget things, Seojun said. It came out very quietly. In 8 months, I have never once seen you forget anything. He let that sit. Then the boardroom doors opened. Malachi Cross walked in. He was not what the directors expected. They had been told, those who had been told anything, that Seojun's brother-in-law was an attorney, which they had filed as a neutral biographical fact. What walked through the boardroom door was a man who had spent 11 years building cases against financial systems designed specifically to avoid him, and who had the specific physical quality of someone who had been waiting for this particular room for a long time and had arrived prepared. He carried a document case. Behind him came two attorneys that Seo-jun did not recognize. International, by the look of them, one with a British firm badge on her lapel. Malachi did not ask for permission to speak. He set the document case on the table, opened it, and spread a financial map across the surface. A large format printout showing the movement of money through a chain of entities that connected, at its far end, to the Kong Syndicate's restoration project accounts, and, at its near end, to 3 holding companies registered under names that meant nothing on their own and everything in context. "My name is Malachi Cross," he said. His voice carried in the room the way voices carried when the person speaking them was not performing confidence but simply had it. "I'm the man your organization identified as my sister's lover. I'm also the attorney who has been documenting this," he tapped the financial map, "for the past 7 months." He looked around the table. Every shell company on this map is connected to the Han family's corporate network. The money moved through the Walram House restoration budget because the renovation project was the cleanest access point inside the Kang Syndicate's legitimate holdings. Someone with detailed knowledge of both organizations set this up. He turned the map so it faced Yura. Someone who knew exactly which line items would pass standard audit review and which accounts would be examined only quarterly. Yura looked at the map. She looked at it the way she had looked at everything this morning, with the composed attention of a woman managing her exposure in real time, calculating what was proven and what was still circumstantial, determining whether the thing in front of her constituted a wall or merely an obstacle. "This is interesting analysis," she said, "but a financial map showing connections between holding companies isn't evidence of my personal involvement in—" "No," Malachi agreed. He reached into the document case again. "This is—" He placed a series of documents on the table. Communication records, transaction authorizations, a series of internal memos, not copies, originals, or certified reproductions of originals, each with authentication marks from the jurisdictions where they had been obtained. "These are authorization signatures for the shell company transactions," he said, "matched to an internal communication thread in which the same author discusses the specific timing of evidence delivery to immigration authorities." He paused. The author used an encrypted messaging platform. The encryption was broken 6 weeks ago by the Financial Crimes Unit of the Prosecutor's Office in 3 jurisdictions. He looked directly at Yura. "It's your writing, your specific phrasing. We had it verified by 2 independent linguistic analysts." The room was very quiet. Director Park, at the far end of the table, pushed his chair back several inches from the table. It was a small movement, almost unconscious, but everyone in the room registered it, the beginning of distance. Yura was still looking at the documents. She was still composed. Seo-jun watched her and understood, watching, that this was the most impressive thing about her. This capacity to remain composed in the moment when composition was costing everything she had. She had built something extraordinary over the past 8 months. She had built it with patience and precision, and the kind of intelligence that most people in rooms like this one would have used to construct legitimate power. Instead, she had used it to construct an intricate, carefully layered destruction of a pregnant woman who had never done anything to her except exist in a position Yura had decided should be hers. "I'd like to speak with my attorney," Yura said. "Your attorney," Jinwoo said from near the door, "is currently being questioned by the prosecutor's office regarding his role in the immigration complaint filing." He paused. "He arrived voluntarily. Apparently he's decided that cooperation is a better position than solidarity." For the first time, something moved across Yura's face that was not managed. It was brief, a fractional tightening around her eyes, a compression at the corners of her mouth. But it was real. The lawyer was the thread she had believed was secure. He had been careful. He had been paid very well to be careful. And he had walked into the prosecutor's office voluntarily, which meant the careful calculations she had made about his loyalty had been wrong, and wrong in a direction she had not prepared for. She looked at Seo-jun. "None of this changes what your wife was doing in that hotel room," she said. Her voice was still even, but the evenness had a new quality now. It was the evenness of someone changing strategy mid-conversation, abandoning one ground to defend another. Whatever my organization's financial arrangements, her brother, Seo-jun said. Yura stopped. Malachi Cross is her brother. Seo-jun kept his voice level. He was aware of his own hands on the table, flat, still, deliberately still. You knew that. You used a photograph taken at an angle that would conceal the fact that I'd met him. You knew I met him. You knew I might recognize him if the photograph showed his full face in context, so you chose the angle. Seo-jun, is must by one. You knew everything about my wife, every detail, her work patterns, her medical appointments. His voice dropped. Her doctor's schedule. The hospital administrator. He watched Yura's face. The administrator who kept postponing her appointments, who kept delaying her monitoring, who told her the clinic was overbooked for 3 consecutive weeks. He watched a new thing happen in Yura's expression. Not guilt, not fear exactly, but the face of someone who had crossed a line they had perhaps told themselves was theoretical and was now discovering it was not. An overdue monitoring appointment in a high-risk pregnancy. That's not strategy anymore. That's something else. The room was absolutely silent. I never intended, Yura started. She's in emergency surgery right now, Seo-jun said. In New Orleans. My daughter was delivered 9 weeks early this morning. His voice did not break. He would not allow it to break in this room. The doctor told me that prolonged emotional trauma and delayed monitoring in a case like hers could trigger catastrophic bleeding. He looked at Yura. My wife collapsed minutes after she landed. Several directors around the table were very still in the way of people who had just understood that the situation they were participating in had a different moral weight than they had assigned to it. Yura said nothing. Her composure was still present, but it had changed its nature. It was no longer the composure of someone managing a situation toward an outcome. It was the composure of someone who had run out of outcomes to manage toward and was standing in the wreckage trying to determine what shape it had. Malachi was looking at her with an expression that Seo-jun had not seen on him before. He had met Malachi once, at a dinner table, and had read him as warm and watchful and carefully protective of his sister. What was on his face now was something beyond protection. It was the expression of a man who had spent 7 months in the dark collecting evidence while his pregnant sister carried danger alone, and who was now standing in a room with the person responsible, and who was exercising a restraint that was costing him visibly. Seo-jun stood. You'll remain available to investigators, he said to Yura. He looked at the other directors. All of you will cooperate fully with the financial audit that begins today. If anyone in this room has information about how evidence was planted in my wife's studio or in the Woolroom House project accounts, you will bring it to Jinwoo before end of business. He picked up the brass key from the table. The merger discussions with the Han Corporation are suspended indefinitely. He walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and looked back at the room, at the directors who were already calculating their distance from Yura, at Malachi, who was watching him with eyes that had not yet decided what they thought of him, at Jinwoo, who was standing near the wall with the expression of a man who had waited a long time for this moment and was finding it less satisfying than he'd expected. He looked at Yura last. She met his eyes. I was protecting the organization, she said. Her voice had gone very quiet. The merger would have stabilized everything. She was my wife, he said. She was the mother of my child, and you spent 8 months building a machine designed to destroy her. He looked at her for one more second. I'll spend the rest of my life making sure every consequence of that machine lands exactly where it belongs. He left. In the corridor outside, Jinwoo fell into step beside him. Neither of them spoke until they reached the elevator. The pavilion, Seo-jun said. I sent 2 men to Woolroom House this morning, Jinwoo said, before Yura's team could reach it. The compartment is intact. Whatever's inside it is still there. The elevator doors opened. We go to the house first, Seo-jun said. Then I go to the airport. Jinwoo nodded. They rode down in silence, and the silence had the quality of something that had been building for a very long time and had finally, at enormous cost, arrived at its reckoning. The pavilion floor of Woolroom House smelled of cedar and cold stone and the particular mineral quality of spaces that had been sealed for a long time. Amani had restored this room herself, had spent 3 weeks on the finish work, had refused to delegate the laying of the final floor panels, had sent the contractor home early on multiple occasions, and stayed alone with the materials and the old drawings and the specific patience of a person who understood that certain things had to be done by hand. The brass key fit the concealed lock in the floor with the precision of something made for exactly this. No resistance, no persuasion required, just the clean alignment of mechanism and intention. The compartment beneath was approximately the size of a document box. Inside it, a sealed folder, a bundled collection of physical documents, a small digital recorder. Seo-jun lifted the recorder with both hands. He pressed play. Amani's voice filled the pavilion. She had recorded this alone, at night, in the specific quiet of a house where she was the only person awake. He could hear it in the recording, the quality of the silence around her voice, the way her breathing was controlled but audible, the sound of a woman who was afraid and was managing it with the precision of someone who had spent years managing things that frightened her. She described the shell companies. She described the fake invoices. She named the accounts, the amounts, the timing. She named the people she suspected, naming them carefully, with the qualification of someone who understood the difference between suspicion and evidence. And at the end of the list, she paused for a long time before saying the name that was hardest. I think Madame Kang may be involved. I can't prove it yet, but the authorization codes for the clinic access. I traced them back to a staff account in the Kang family legal office. And the only person who has unrestricted access to that office is... She stopped. She started again. I'm not going to name her on this recording until I can prove it, because if I'm wrong, I've destroyed something he can never get back. And if I'm right... A long pause. If I'm right, he spent his whole life believing she was protecting him. The truth would... Her voice caught. It would destroy him. And I don't want to be the thing that destroys him. I want to be the thing that... The recording ended. The battery had died mid-sentence, or she had stopped it deliberately, or the moment had simply become too much to continue. Seo-jun sat on the pavilion floor of the house his wife had restored and held the recorder with the play symbol still lit on the small screen and felt something move through him that had no name in any language he spoke. Something that was grief and rage and shame all compacted into a single, dense, unbearable weight. She had protected his mother who had signed the immigration order, his mother who had authorized the clinic access, his mother who had sat at the end of the table with her hands folded and her face arranged into the expression of a woman who had already won something, and Amani had known, had suspected, had traced the authorization codes, had stood on the edge of the truth, and had chosen not to put his mother's name on a recording because she was afraid it would destroy him. Outside the pavilion, Jinwoo's phone rang. Jinwoo stepped to the doorway and answered it, and listened for perhaps 30 seconds. Then he came back inside and stood near the compartment with his hands at his sides. The prosecutor's office, he said. Yura's lawyer gave them everything, the full communication chain. It includes correspondence with a third party who provided the authorization codes for the clinic access and co-signed the immigration complaint. Seo-jun looked up. Jinwoo held his gaze. Your mother's name is on the correspondence, he said. Her personal authorization signature, not a staff account, not a forgery. A pause. Hers. The hospital exit led out onto a side street where two of the cars from Seo-jun's New Orleans security detail were parked. Not conspicuously, not in a way that announced their purpose. Just two dark sedans at the curb that happened to have men inside them who happened to be watching the street with the specific quality of attention that had nothing to do with being parked. Seo-jun came through the door at a pace that was not quite running because running in a hospital exit attracted the wrong kind of attention, but it was the pace of a man who had made a calculation and was executing it without hesitation. The nearer of the two drivers was out of the car before Seo-jun reached the curb. Copy shop on Magazine Street, Seo-jun said. Now. He got in the back. The driver was in the front before the door closed. The second car pulled out behind them without being told. Seo-jun's phone buzzed. Jinwoo. Plate comes back to a rental. Rented yesterday under a name that doesn't exist. They planned this before Yura was formally charged. He typed back, Who authorized the rental? Jinwoo. Credit line traces to a subsidiary of the Han family holding network. one that wasn't in Malachi's original financial map. Seojun stared at this for a moment. A subsidiary that wasn't in Malachi's map meant a subsidiary that had been kept separate, deliberately, carefully, with the specific foresight of someone who had anticipated that the primary network might be exposed and had built a secondary layer beneath it that would survive the exposure. Someone who had been planning not just the operation, but the operation's failure state. Someone who had thought further ahead than Yura herself, which meant someone above Yura in the decision chain who had not yet appeared in the investigation. He called Jin Woo. The subsidiary, he said the moment Jin Woo picked up. Who controls it? Still running the trace. The registration is layered. 3 shell entities before you reach a human signature. How long? 20 minutes minimum. The jurisdictions don't cooperate fast. I need it in 10. I understand what you need. Jin Woo's voice had the flat precision of a man operating at the edge of what was possible and not interested in acknowledging the edge. I'm working it. The car turned onto Magazine Street. Seojun saw the copy shop from a block away. A narrow-fronted store with a bright sign and a window full of equipment, the kind of place that did exactly what its name promised, and nothing else. He saw Malachi through the window, standing at the counter with his document case open, talking to a clerk. He saw the 2 men on the sidewalk outside, not together, not obviously coordinated, positioned on opposite sides of the shop entrance with the careful spacing of people who had been told to look unrelated and had done a professional enough job of it that most pedestrians walking past would register them as simply 2 men waiting, one checking his phone, one looking at the street. Seojun had spent 20 years learning to read the difference between men who were waiting and men who were positioned. These were positioned. Stop here, he said. The car stopped half a block from the shop. The second car pulled alongside and the driver's window came down. Seojun looked at the man behind it, one of Jin Woo's people, sent ahead from Seoul 3 days ago when the situation in New Orleans had clarified into something that required a physical presence. 2 outside the entrance, Seojun said. 3rd vehicle 2 blocks east, circling. The 2 outside are watching the exit. They're waiting for him to come out with the files. He looked at the copy shop window. Malachi had finished at the counter. He was organizing documents back into his case. He would be at the door in 2 minutes. I need the 2 outside moved away from the entrance before he walks out. Quietly. No escalation. The driver looked at him. Moved how? However it takes? He met the driver's eyes. But no escalation. We are 3 blocks from a hospital. We are 3 blocks from my wife and my daughter. Nothing happens on this street that brings police here in the next 20 minutes. The driver nodded. He and his partner got out of the car. Seojun got out of his car. He did not go to the copy shop entrance. He went to the narrow alley beside the building, a service access, barely wide enough for a delivery cart, running between the copy shop and the dry cleaner next to it, and positioned himself at the corner where he could see the entrance without being visible from the street. He watched. Jin Woo's 2 men moved with the practiced ordinariness of people who had learned that the most effective concealment was simply behaving like they belonged to the space they were moving through. They split without appearing to split, one angling toward the man checking his phone, the other drifting toward the man watching the street. Not converging, not surrounding, just 2 separate pedestrian trajectories that happened to end in conversations. Seojun watched the man checking his phone register the approach and make the calculation. Escalate or disengage. The calculation took approximately 3 seconds. The man checked something in his peripheral vision, looking for backup positioning, finding it absent or uncertain, and then the specific loosening in his posture that meant he had decided this was not the moment for escalation. He walked away. The second man's conversation lasted a few seconds longer, visible from Seojun's position as a brief, close exchange with the quality of 2 people determining where they stood relative to each other and concluding they did not want to find out the specifics. Then the second man also walked. The copy shop door opened. Malachi came out with his document case under one arm and his phone to his ear, walking with the focused urgency of a man who had been told to move fast and had taken the instructions seriously. He looked left, looked right, registered the absence of the 2 men who had presumably been visible to him through the shop window, and his pace didn't slow, but something in his face sharpened. He saw Seojun at the alley entrance. He came directly to him. Jin Woo called me, Malachi said. His voice was low and fast. He said, intercept attempt. How many? 2 outside, a 3rd circling 2 blocks east. The 3rd one still out there? Yes. Malachi looked at the street. He was thinking fast. Seojun could see it, the way his eyes moved over the available information and organized it. I have certified copies of everything in here. He tapped the document case. The originals are with your man Jin Woo in Seoul. He took custody this morning with the prosecutor's office there. These copies are for the New Orleans filing, which, he checked his watch, closes in 68 minutes. How far is the prosecutor's office from here? 12 minutes by car. I called ahead. Someone is meeting me at the entrance. He looked at Seojun. The third vehicle is the problem. If they're circling, they're watching the street exits. I know. If they see me get into a car, they'll follow, Seojun said, and the street between here and the prosecutor's office gives them 2 minutes of opportunity. Malachi looked at him. There was a moment between them, the specific moment of two men who did not fully trust each other and did not fully distrust each other either, standing in an alley 3 blocks from a hospital, holding between them the documents that constituted the difference between justice and delay. What do you want to do, Egg? Malachi said. 2 cars, Seojun said. You take the first one. It goes directly to the prosecutor's office. My driver, my route, my people at the destination. He held Malachi's eyes. The second car takes a different route. Longer, more visible. If the third vehicle is going to follow something, it follows the second car. And you? I'm in the second car. Malachi looked at him for a moment that was slightly longer than the situation strictly required. You understand that if the third vehicle decides following isn't enough? I understand, Seojun said. You're 3 blocks from your wife. You're 3 blocks from your daughter. I know where I am. Seojun looked at the document case under Malachi's arm. Those files clear your sister's name, publicly, permanently, on the record. He paused. Whatever it costs to get them delivered on time is worth paying. Malachi held his gaze. Then he reached into the document case and pulled out a sealed envelope and held it out. Seojun took it. Certified copy of the complete evidence summary, Malachi said. Everything compressed into the key documents, the forged medical report, the communication chain, the financial map, the authentication signatures. He paused. If something happens to me before I reach the office, that envelope contains enough to establish the case without the full filing. Seojun looked at the envelope. He looked at Malachi. Nothing is going to happen to you, he said. Get in the first car. Malachi looked at him one more time. Then he walked toward the first car without looking back, the document case tight under his arm, moving with the focused, deliberate pace of a man who had spent 11 years building toward this moment, and was not going to be stopped 3 blocks from delivering it. Seojun put the sealed envelope inside his jacket. He got in the second car. Go, he said. Main Street, slow enough to be seen. The car pulled out. In his side mirror, 40 seconds later, he saw the third vehicle, a dark SUV, rental plates, pull away from its circling position and fall in behind them. His phone buzzed. Jinwoo. Subsidiary trace complete. Human signature at the end of the chain, Han Byung-chul. Han Yura's uncle. Primary financial architect of the Han family network. Seojun read this twice. Han Byung-chul was not a name that appeared in any of the investigation documents. He was not a name that appeared in any of the boardroom conversations or the evidence Malachi had compiled or the communication chain that Yura's lawyer had provided to the prosecutor. He was, Seojun knew from his own intelligence files, the man who had built the Han family's financial structures across 3 decades, the person behind the visible people, the architect who never appeared in the foreground because he had designed his own invisibility into the system from the beginning. He typed back, forward to prosecutor's office in Seoul and New Orleans simultaneously. Now, don't wait for me. Jinwoo, already sending. Seojun put his phone in his pocket. The SUV was 2 cars behind them, maintaining its distance with the specific patience of a vehicle that was not trying to close the gap yet. Content to track, waiting for the right geometry of street and opportunity. Seojun looked out the window at New Orleans passing, the shotgun houses, the old oaks, the afternoon light doing what afternoon light did in this city, turning everything amber and slightly unreal. The light of a place that had been rebuilt so many times, it had developed an aesthetic relationship with its own impermanence. Imani had loved this city before she loved Seoul. She had told him once that New Orleans had taught her something that most American cities hadn't, that beauty and damage were not opposites, but collaborators, that the most interesting structures were the ones that had survived things they weren't built to survive and bore the evidence of that survival in their materials. She had been describing buildings. She had also been describing herself. She had also, he understood now, been describing what she was trying to build with him. His phone buzzed. A number he didn't recognize. New Orleans area code. He answered. "Mr. Kang." A woman's voice, professional, clipped. "This is Assistant Prosecutor Dana Reeves. I have Malachi Cross in my office. He's indicated you may have a secondary evidence packet and that your current location involves an active surveillance situation." "That's accurate," Seojun said. "I need to ask you directly. Are you in physical danger?" He looked in the side mirror. The SUV was still there, still 2 cars back, still patient. "Not yet," he said. "I'm going to put you on hold for 30 seconds, the prosecutor said. "I'm making a call." She put him on hold. He watched the mirror. The SUV maintained its distance. The prosecutor came back. "I have a patrol unit 2 minutes from your current location. I need you to tell me your exact street," he told her. "Stay in the vehicle. Do not engage with whoever is following you. The patrol unit will establish a visible presence. If they're professionals, that ends the follow." A pause. "And Mr. Kang, the evidence package your brother-in-law just delivered is more than sufficient for the filing. Whatever is in that envelope you're carrying is supplementary. Your physical safety is not worth an evidence supplement." "It's not supplementary," he said. "It's a trail that leads to Han Byung-chul." A silence. "Say that name again?" she said. He said it again. Another silence, longer this time. He could hear her thinking, or not thinking, processing, reorganizing everything she knew about the case around a new central figure. "Where did you get that name?" she said. "My investigator, Seoul-based. He's already forwarding documentation to both your office and the Seoul prosecutor simultaneously. Han Byung-chul is—" She stopped. "He's been on a separate federal watch list for 18 months, completely unconnected to this case, or so we thought." Another pause. "If he's the financial signature behind the subsidiary that funded this intercept attempt, then Yura's operation wasn't the primary operation," Seojun said. "It was the visible layer." The patrol car came around the corner ahead of them at that moment. Not lights, not siren, just a marked unit pulling into a natural position in the flow of traffic that happened to place it directly in the SUV's line of sight. In the mirror, Seojun watched the SUV slow further, then make a right turn at the next intersection and disappear from the mirror entirely. He exhaled, slowly, through his nose, the way Amani exhaled when she was managing something her body had been holding too long. "The patrol unit worked," he said into the phone. "Good." The prosecutor's voice had shifted, still professional, but with a new quality of focus in it, the sound of someone who had just watched a case expand in real time and was already thinking 3 steps ahead. "Mr. Kang, I need you to come in with that envelope." "I'm on my way," he said. He looked at his driver. "Prosecutor's office?" "Direct route." The driver nodded and made the turn. Seojun sat back in the seat and put his hand over the envelope inside his jacket. Felt the edges of it through the fabric, the slight thickness of the documents inside, the specific physical weight of 7 months of his wife's work compressed into a sealed packet that had just been carried through a New Orleans afternoon by a man who had signed his wife's deportation order 12 days ago. The distance between those two facts was not measurable in days. He called Jin Woo. "It worked," he said. "I know. I had eyes on the street." A pause. "The filing?" "Malachi's already with the prosecutor. I'm bringing the supplementary package now." Another pause. "The Han Byung-chul documentation. Make sure the Seoul filing includes his full financial network. Everything, not just the subsidiary connection. Everything." "It's already in the package," Jinwoo said. "I've been building that file for 6 days." Seojun was quiet for a moment. "You knew about Byung-chul 6 days ago." "I suspected. I wanted confirmation before I gave you a name that would require a response." A brief pause. "I know how you respond to names." Seojun looked out the window. "Good call," he said. He ended the call. The prosecutor's office was a gray building on a gray street that had the functional solidity of a place that understood its own purpose and had no interest in architectural expression. Seo Jun was met at the entrance by a paralegal who had clearly been waiting for him and who led him through the building with the wordless efficiency of someone following specific instructions. The elevator, a corridor, a conference room where Malachi was sitting across a table from Assistant Prosecutor Dana Reeves, who was in her late 40s, compact, with the look of someone who had made a decision about her own authority early in her career and had never revisited it. She looked at Seo Jun when he came in. He sat down across from her and took the envelope from inside his jacket and placed it on the table. She looked at it. She looked at him. "Mr. Kang," she said, "I've spent the last 20 minutes reading through what your brother-in-law delivered. And I've spent the last 4 minutes reading an email from my counterpart in Seoul about Han Byung-chul." She placed her hands flat on the table. "I need to understand the full scope of what you're giving me before I open that envelope. Because if it connects to the federal watch list case the way it appears to connect..." She paused. "This is no longer just a fraud and conspiracy case." "I understand what it is," Seo Jun said. "Do you understand that your own organization's financial records are going to come under additional scrutiny if Byung-chul's network connects to yours?" "My organization's legitimate financial records can survive any scrutiny." He held her eyes. "The criminal operations that ran through my organization were not sanctioned by me and were conducted by people who are now either in custody or cooperating with your office. I'm aware that distinction requires proving rather than asserting." He paused. "Which is why I'm sitting in your office at 4:47 in the afternoon, delivering evidence rather than not delivering it." Reeves looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Malachi. Malachi had been quiet since Seo Jun came in, watching, with the expression of a man who had been watching Kang Seo Jun for the past 10 days and was continuously updating his assessment. He looked at his brother-in-law now with an expression that was not warm and was not cold and was not yet decided. He gave the prosecutor a small nod. She opened the envelope. She read for 6 minutes without speaking. The room was very quiet. Outside, the sounds of the building, the hum of HVAC, a distant phone ringing, footsteps in the corridor, continued their ordinary operations. Inside, 3 people sat around a table, and the clock moved toward 5 o'clock, and the afternoon light through the conference room window turned from amber to the darker, richer gold of late afternoon. At 4:59, Dana Reeves looked up from the documents. "The filing window is still open for 1 minute," she said to someone outside the door. A paralegal who had apparently been positioned there for exactly this. "Get these into the system. Now." She looked at Seo Jun. "Han Byung-chul is going to have a very difficult week," she said. Seo Jun said nothing. "Your wife's name will be formally cleared in both jurisdictions within 48 hours, she continued. "The public filing will be explicit. Every accusation, every charge, every implication, all of it reversed on the record." He nodded. "Mr. Kang." She studied him with the specific attention of a prosecutor who had learned to read people through their documentation before she read them in person, and who was now comparing the 2 readings. "I need to ask you something outside the scope of this case." He waited. "Your organization," she said. "The criminal side. Not the development company. The actual organization." She paused. "What are your intentions?" The question sat at the room with the weight of a question that had been building since before he walked through her door. A question that was about more than the case, that was about the gap between what Amani had spent 18 months trying to build and what he had spent 20 years running. He looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at Malachi. Malachi looked back at him with the expression of a man who had asked this question in his own mind approximately 40 times in the past week and had not received an answer he was satisfied with. Seo Jun looked at the prosecutor. "My daughter is in a NICU 3 blocks from here," he said. "She weighs 3 pounds and 2 ounces. She was born 9 weeks early because the people running my organization's criminal operations caused my wife enough harm and enough delayed medical care that her pregnancy became an emergency." He paused. "The organization my father built was supposed to become something else under my management. It didn't. I made choices that kept it what it was, and I told myself those choices were necessary, and I let the necessary become an excuse for not doing the harder thing." He looked at Reeves steadily. "I'm not going to sit in your office and make you a promise I don't know if I can keep. What I can tell you is that my daughter is going to grow up knowing what her mother stood for. And I'm going to spend whatever time I'm given making sure she doesn't have to be ashamed of what her father did." Reeves held his gaze. "That's not an answer," she said. "No," he said. "It's not." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "The filing is complete. You're free to go." He stood. Malachi stood. They walked out of the conference room together, down the corridor, into the elevator. The doors closed. The elevator moved downward. Neither of them spoke for the first 2 floors. Then Malachi said, "For what it's worth." Seo-jun looked at him. "The past 10 days. Malachi was looking at the elevator doors. "The way you've been at that hospital, the way you talked to my mother, the way you handled the street today." He paused. "It's not enough. Not even close. But it's not nothing either." The elevator opened. They walked out into the lobby. Through the building's glass entrance, the New Orleans afternoon was burning itself out in the specific spectacular way of Louisiana late light. The sky going orange and purple, and the shadows long and the whole city lit from the side like something being examined rather than observed. "I need to get back to the hospital," Seo-jun said. "I know," Malachi said. They walked through the doors. Outside, Seo-jun stopped on the sidewalk and looked at the sky for a moment, at the specific, extravagant dying of the afternoon light over a city that had been rebuilt so many times that rebuilding was encoded in its character, in its music, in the way its people carried damage without letting it become definition. His phone buzzed. A text from the NICU nurse. "Baby's oxygen saturation improved significantly in the last hour. Doctor very pleased. She's fighting hard." He read it twice. He put his phone in his pocket. He looked at Malachi. "She's doing better," he said. Malachi closed his eyes for a moment. Just a moment. Then opened them with the expression of a man recalibrating every muscle in his face towards something he wasn't going to let himself fully feel yet, because the situation wasn't resolved enough to afford it. "Good," he said. His voice was rough on the word. "That's good." They got in the car. The driver pulled into traffic. 3 blocks away, in a NICU room on the 4th floor of University Medical Center, Ariel Kang was reaching her hands into the air of her incubator with the absolute committed persistence of something that had decided it was going to stay. And on the other side of the plexiglass, her mother was watching her with eyes that had been through everything and were still open. And in the hospital's corridor outside, walking back from the elevator with his jacket over his arm and the prosecutor's receipt folded in his breast pocket, Kang Seo-jun moved through the building toward his wife and his daughter with the specific quality of a man who had run out of things to hide behind and was walking, for the first time in a very long time, in plain sight. The 48 hours after the prosecutor's filing were the quietest Seo-jun had experienced in 20 years of running an organization that did not believe in quiet. He spent them in the hospital, not performing presence, not sitting in the corridor with his phone managing the organization's response to the investigation, not holding meetings in the waiting room, not conducting the kind of visible vigil that was really a demonstration of concern rather than the thing itself. He simply stayed. He learned the NICU schedule and adapted to it. He learned which nurses preferred silence during their rounds and which ones talked through their work, and found both kinds easier to be around than he expected. He learned that Ariel's oxygen saturation improved consistently between 6 and 8 in the morning, something in the shift change, the nurses theorized, the subtle difference in ambient noise level, and he was there every morning at 5:50 to watch it happen. He brought Amani coffee at 7 each morning, not from the hospital cafeteria. From the cafe 4 blocks away that her mother had pointed him toward on the second day, the one that had been on the same corner since before the flood, that made coffee the way the neighborhood made everything, with the specific commitment of people who understood that consistency was its own form of devotion. He wrote her name on the cup. He had been writing her name on cups for 2 years. He had never stopped, even when he had no right to, even when the cup was sitting on a bedside table in a hotel room that had already been paid for by an organization intent on removing her from the country. He had written her name on the cup from the hospital cafeteria on the 3rd night, before she was awake enough to drink it, and left it where she would see it when she opened her eyes. She had seen it. She had not said anything about it, but she had drunk the coffee. On the morning of the 3rd day, The formal public announcement came through from both prosecutors' offices simultaneously, Seoul and New Orleans, coordinated, timed, comprehensive. Imani Cross Kang had been fully exonerated on all charges. The immigration fraud accusation, the financial crimes allegations, the residency violation, every count reversed on the record, with a formal statement acknowledging that the evidence against her had been fabricated as part of a criminal conspiracy, now resulting in multiple arrests. Her name appeared in the filing as the originating investigator whose evidence had formed the foundation of the prosecution's case. Jin Woo sent Seo Jun the filing simultaneously with a separate message that said only, "Press conference scheduled for this afternoon, Seoul. I'll handle it." Seo Jun sent back, "Make sure they understand she was trying to save the organization, not just that she was innocent, that she was actively protecting it while being prosecuted." Jin Woo. Already in the prepared statement, word for word, Seo Jun put his phone in his pocket and carried the coffee down the hospital corridor toward Imani's room. She was awake when he came in. She was always awake before he arrived now. Had developed, in the particular alertness of a woman whose body was healing while her mind refused to slow down, the habit of being already sitting up and oriented toward the day before anyone brought her anything. Her laptop was open. She was reading something. Not work files, he could tell from the angle of her eyes on the screen, something she was processing rather than reviewing. She looked up when he came in. He set the coffee on the rolling table and moved it toward her without comment. She looked at the cup. She looked at him. "It's done," he said. "The announcement is out, both jurisdictions." She wrapped both hands around the cup. She looked at the coffee rather than at him for a moment. The specific looking away of a person absorbing something that was not entirely good news, even though it was the outcome they had worked toward, because the outcome arriving meant the crisis was formally over, and the thing that lived inside the crisis, the sustained emergency that had been keeping certain feelings in suspension, was no longer available as a container. "How bad is the press coverage?" she said. "Extensive." He sat in the chair. "Your name is being covered the same way it was covered when they were accusing you, which means the correction is getting the same amplification." He paused. "That's as it should be." She looked out the window. "Woolrim House," she said. "Intact. Jinwoo has it secured. The foundation documents are registered. I had them verified by 3 separate attorneys to make sure there are no grounds for challenge." He paused. "It's yours, fully and legally yours, independent of anything connected to me." She was quiet for a moment. "The board," she said, "restructuring. Park is running it competently. 3 directors have resigned pending investigation. The remaining 5 are cooperating with the audit." He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees. "The legitimate development business is going to survive this. It's going to be diminished for a period, and there are contracts that will need renegotiation, but the core operations, the ones that were running clean, those survive. Because of the evidence I gathered. Because of the evidence you gathered." She absorbed this. She drank her coffee with both hands still wrapped around the cup, slowly, with the attention of someone for whom the warmth of the thing was as important as the content. "Seo Jun," she said. "Yes." "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly, not strategically, not with one eye on how the answer is going to land. Just honestly." "Yes," he said. She looked at him directly. Her eyes were clear, not the drugged clarity of the first days in recovery, but the genuine clarity of a woman who had been through something extreme and had come out the other side knowing exactly what she was and what she needed to know. "If none of this had happened," she said, "if Yura had never come back, if your mother had never moved against me, if there were no crisis, no investigation, no hospital, if we were just living in Woolrim House in an ordinary month, 2 years into our marriage," she paused, "would you have trusted me? Eventually, with the difficult things, the things you were afraid of. Would you have chosen me over your pride?" He sat with the question. He sat with it the way she had taught him to sit with difficult things, not rushing to answer, not reaching immediately for the words that would resolve the discomfort, just holding it, letting it exist at its full weight. "I don't know," he said finally. She nodded. Once. The nod of a woman who had already known the answer and had asked the question anyway, because she needed to hear him say it. "That's what I thought," she said. Not cruelly, not with the satisfaction of being right. Simply with the steadiness of someone marking a fact they needed to mark in order to move forward accurately. "I'm trying to know," he said. "That's the difference. I didn't know what I was capable of choosing until I saw the cost of choosing wrong. I'm not asking you to credit me for that. I'm just telling you it's true." She looked at him. "I know it's true, Issa," she said. "I can see it. I've been watching you for 10 days and I can see it." She set the coffee down. "That's what makes this hard. If I couldn't see it, this would be simple." She pressed her hands flat against the table. "It would be finished. I'd file the papers from this hospital bed and I'd build my career around the foundation, and I'd raise Ariel with Malachi and my mother, and I'd be fine." A pause. "But I can see it, and I've loved you long enough that seeing it means something I'm not ready to throw away." He was very still. "I'm not forgiving you," she said. "Not today, not tomorrow. I don't know when. I might not ever be able to forgive what happened at the airport completely. I need you to understand that's a real possibility, that there are things that happen between people that love can survive without forgiveness fully healing them." "I understand," he said. "But I'm not finished with you," she said. "That's what I know right now. I'm not finished, and our daughter is in a room upstairs reaching her hands out, looking for something to hold, and she deserves parents who are trying." She looked at him steadily. "So I'm telling you, I'm trying. That's what I have right now. Just trying." He held her gaze. He thought about all the things he could say, the declarations, the promises, the arrangements he had already made, and the ones he was prepared to make, the full architecture of what he intended to build in the space of what had been broken. He thought about saying all of it. He said none of it. "Thank you," he said. She held his gaze for a moment longer. Then she picked up her coffee and looked back at her laptop, and the conversation was over in the way of conversations between people who had learned to let the important things land without immediately burying them under the next thing. He sat in the chair beside her and did not speak, and the room held the particular quality of silence that existed between two people who had been through something enormous and were sitting on the other side of it, not at peace and not at war, somewhere in the long, difficult territory between those two states where most of actual life was conducted. Ariel came home from the NICU on a Tuesday, 37 days after she arrived in the world 9 weeks ahead of schedule. She weighed 5 pounds and 1 ounce, which the neonatologist described as remarkable for her gestational age and circumstances, and which Loretta Cross described as exactly what she expected from a child who had chosen, apparently, to be dramatic about her arrival, but was going to be perfectly fine once she committed to being here. Imani carried her out of the hospital. She had insisted on this. The nurses had offered a wheelchair, standard protocol, offered to every discharge patient. And Imani had looked at the wheelchair with the expression she reserved for suggestions she found unnecessary and had said, politely and finally, that she was going to carry her daughter out of this building on her own 2 feet. She had been walking without assistance for 2 weeks. She had been discharged from her own recovery for 10 days. Her body was not at full capacity and would not be for some months, and she was aware of this with the precise attention of a woman who had learned, in the most visceral possible way, what happened when the body's signals were not taken seriously. She took them seriously now. She carried Ariel through the hospital lobby and through the automatic doors and out into the New Orleans morning, into the specific quality of a November morning in this city, cool and luminous, the air carrying the particular combination of humidity and wood smoke that Imani had been breathing her whole life without fully registering as the smell of being home. She stood on the hospital steps and held her daughter against her chest and breathed it in. Ariel was awake. Her eyes, dark, slightly unfocused in the manner of the very new, doing the slow work of learning what sight was for, moved across the light with the absorbed attention of someone encountering something for the first time and finding it larger than anticipated. She made a small sound, not distress, something more like consideration, a noise in the back of her throat that might have been the beginning of an opinion. "I know," Imani said quietly, against the top of her head. "It's a lot." Seojun was standing at the bottom of the steps, beside the car, with his hands at his sides. He had learned in the past month to position himself in Imani's peripheral vision rather than directly in her line of sight when she was in a moment that was hers, had learned it through attention rather than instruction, the way he was learning most things now, by watching rather than asking. Loretta came through the doors behind Imani. She stood beside her daughter and looked at her granddaughter with the expression of a woman who had been through enough to know that moments like this one were not promised, that the world contained an infinite variety of mechanisms for preventing them, and that when they arrived, they deserved to be fully inhabited. She put her hand on Imani's back. She didn't say anything. Imani leaned into her mother's hand for one moment. Just one. The weight of a lifetime of being held up by this specific person expressed in a single, small lean, and then straightened and walked down the steps. She stopped in front of Seo Jun. He looked at Ariel. She was looking at him, or doing the infant approximation of looking, orienting toward the source of a presence, the dark eyes moving in the direction of his face, the whole body doing the slow, instinctive work of recognizing something as significant without yet having the categories to explain why. "Here," Imani said. She held Ariel out toward him. He took her. He had held her twice before, both times in the NICU, both times in the careful, supervised context of the incubator portal and the nursing staff nearby. He had not yet held her outside the hospital, in the open air, with no equipment between them and nothing to catch her if his hands were wrong. His hands were not wrong. He held her against his chest with the careful completeness of a man who had been thinking about how to hold her since the night he first understood she existed, and who had arrived at it not through instruction but through the specific intelligence of the body, which sometimes understood things before the mind did. Ariel made the sound again, the small, considered noise. She wrapped her hand around his finger. He looked down at her hand and his throat moved, and he did not look up for a moment because there were things he needed to do in his own face before he let anyone see it. When he looked up, Imani was watching him with the expression she wore when she was seeing something she had wondered about and was now confirming. "She likes you," Imani said. "She doesn't know me well enough yet to like me," he said. "She knows your voice." Imani tilted her head slightly. "She's been hearing you for 2 months through an incubator. She knows what you sound like." He looked back down at Ariel. "Then she knows the version of me from the past 2 months," he said. "That's the version I'm introducing her to," Imani said. "The rest she'll learn when she's old enough, and she'll make her own assessment." He held his daughter in the November morning light and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that was more complete than the fact of her hand around his finger, and the fact that she was here, and the fact that Imani was standing 3 feet away, choosing to introduce them. Malachi left for Seoul 2 weeks later. He had been in New Orleans for 6 weeks in total, the longest he had stayed in one place in 3 years, he said, and his apartment in D.C. was probably evolving its own ecosystem in his absence. He had an office to return to, a partner who had been covering his caseload with increasing impatience, and a filing with the International Financial Crimes Unit that required his physical presence to complete. He came to his mother's house the night before his flight. Loretta made dinner. Not a small dinner, the kind of dinner that acknowledged an occasion without naming it directly, the kind that required the dining room table and the good plates and the specific attention to detail that Loretta Cross brought to things she understood were being done for the last time in a particular configuration. Seo Jun was there. He had been spending his evenings at Loretta's house for 2 weeks, not staying, not presuming that level of inclusion, but coming for dinner and staying for the conversation afterward and driving back to the hotel at a reasonable hour. He had fallen into this rhythm without designing it, which was how he had fallen into the good rhythms with Imani at Walrim House, not by constructing them deliberately, but by being present long enough for them to form around him. Loretta had not invited him explicitly. She had simply stopped not inviting him, which in Loretta Cross's household amounted to the same thing. After dinner, after the dishes, after Imani had taken Ariel upstairs for the feeding that happened at precisely 9:30 with the predictable reliability of a small person who had decided to have opinions about schedules, Malachi and Seo Jun sat on the front porch in the November cool with glasses of the bourbon Malachi had brought from a distillery he'd visited in Kentucky that he claimed produced the most honest liquor he'd ever encountered. They sat for a while without talking. This was something Seo Jun had not expected to find in Malachi Cross, the capacity for comfortable silence. He had read Malachi from their first meeting as a man whose intelligence expressed itself primarily through language, through question and argument and the precise management of information. He had not anticipated the other register, the one that came out on a porch at night with bourbon, the quietness of a man who had been through something alongside another person and had not yet decided how to categorize the result. What happens when she goes back? Malachi said eventually. He meant Seoul. He meant Wolrim House. He meant the life that existed on the other side of the past 6 weeks. The question that had been living in the background of everything since Ariel came home. The shape of what came next, geographically and otherwise. She decides, Seojun said. Whatever she decides. I've made that clear to her. She knows that. I know she knows it. He held the glass without drinking from it. I'm telling you. Malachi was quiet for a moment. She's going to want to go back. Not for you. For the work. For Wolrim House. He looked out at the street. She's been building that place for 2 years. She's not going to let it sit finished without her in it. I know. That doesn't mean she's ready to rebuild what broke between you. I know that too. Those are 2 separate things, Malachi said. Going back to Seoul and going back to the marriage. They're not the same decision. I understand the difference. Malachi drank his bourbon. He looked at the street for a while, the Treme neighborhood at night, the specific quality of light from the old street lamps, the sound of music from somewhere a few blocks away. She told me something the night she called from the airport, he said, not looking at Seojun. When the immigration officers were in the hallway, she called me and she said she wasn't calling for help. She said she was calling to tell me where the evidence was. He paused. And then she said, I need to tell you this because you're the only person who will understand what it costs. She said the hardest part wasn't what he did. It was that she still loved him while he was doing it. Seojun was still. She said love doesn't stop on command, Malachi continued. She said she had tried to stop it on the way to the terminal, and she couldn't. And she said that was the worst part. Not the airport, not the signing, the fact that she was standing in the departure hall being escorted out of the country, and she still loved him, and she couldn't make herself not. He finally looked at Seojun. Seojun met his eyes. I'm telling you this, Malachi said, not because I think you deserve to hear it, but because I think you need to understand what it cost her to stay loving you through what you did, and what it will cost her if she chooses to continue. He paused. Because I need you to know the price before you accept what's being offered. Seojun looked at him. I know the price, he said. I'm going to spend the rest of my life knowing it. Malachi held his gaze for a long moment. Then he looked back at the street. They finished their bourbon in silence. Han Byung-chul was arrested in Zurich 3 weeks after the New Orleans filing. He had been in Switzerland for 11 days by the time the international warrant reached the local authorities, long enough to have moved significant funds through the secondary network that Jin Woo's trace had uncovered, not long enough to have made them disappear entirely. The seizure of his accounts, combined with the financial records from Malachi's investigation and the subsidiary documentation from New Orleans, constituted what the prosecutor's office in Seoul described in its public statement as the most comprehensive financial crimes case filed against a Korean national in the past decade. Han Byung-chul had no statement. His attorney issued something that contained the words in unsubstantiated and politically motivated and full cooperation with appropriate authorities, which was the language of a defense that had not yet decided which version of cooperation would cause the least damage and was buying time. It did not buy enough. Yura's sentencing came 4 months after her arrest. The charges: conspiracy, financial fraud, evidence fabrication, witness intimidation, criminal endangerment, carried combined penalties that her attorneys had spent 4 months attempting to reduce through cooperation agreements, character references, and the argument that the endangerment charge exceeded the scope of her demonstrable intent. The judge rejected the last argument in language that was, for judicial writing, unusually direct. Intent to cause harm and recklessness about harm were not distinguishable when the predictable consequence of authorized actions was the medical compromise of a pregnant woman in a high-risk condition. The sentence was 12 years. Jinwoo texted Seojun the moment the verdict came through. Seojun was in the Wolrim House courtyard when the text arrived. He was standing near the persimmon tree, which had, with the approach of spring, begun producing the preliminary signs of new growth, small buds at the ends of the bare branches that were barely visible, but definitively present. He read the text. He typed back, "Tell Malachi." Jinwoo. "Already did. He says Imani knows." Seojun put his phone in his pocket and stood with his hand resting lightly on the bark of the persimmon tree, and looked at the courtyard, at the restored western face, the east corridor connection, the stone bench, the pavilion with its new floor and its empty compartment, at the whole recovered, rebuilt, patiently reconstructed space that Amani had spent 2 years making out of something that had been falling apart. He thought about what it cost, not the money. The money was the easy part, had always been the easy part. He had spent 20 years understanding money's relationship to difficulty and had long ago concluded that financial cost was the variety of cost that bothered people least when the other varieties were at stake. He thought about what it cost in the other currency, in attention, in patience, in the willingness to be wrong about something and correct it carefully rather than simply moving past it, in the specific stubbornness of showing up to a thing daily, even when the daily showing up offered no visible evidence of progress. He thought about the 3 weeks she had spent on the pavilion floor alone. He thought about the 40-minute wait in front of the excavator. He thought about the recording, her voice in the empty pavilion, afraid and careful and choosing, in the middle of everything, to protect a man who did not deserve it. He heard the gate behind him. He turned. Amani came through the gate with Ariel strapped against her chest in the carrier she had bought in New Orleans. The one that allowed Ariel to face outward now that she was big enough and strong enough to hold her head with the wobbling, triumphant determination of a person discovering what heads were for. Ariel was looking at the courtyard with the expression she wore when encountering something new. The total absorption of a 3-month-old for whom everything was still arriving for the first time. Imani had come back to Seoul 6 weeks ago. She had come back for the foundation work. There were structural decisions that required her physical presence, contractor meetings that could not be conducted remotely, and the specific relationship between an architect and a building she was responsible for that required her body in the space. She had come back for the work, and she had brought Ariel, and she had moved into the Woolroom House residence apartment that had always technically been hers under the foundation documents, and she had been living and working there for 6 weeks with Seojun present and not quite resident, occupying the space between invited and returned to in a way that neither of them had named yet, because naming it would require a conversation they were both approaching gradually rather than directly. She saw him at the tree. She came across the courtyard and stood beside him, and they both looked at the new growth on the branches for a moment. Ariel looked at it too. Her eyes tracked the slight movement of the buds in the early spring breeze with the focused intensity she brought to anything that moved. She was going to be, Loretta had declared with the confidence of a woman making a diagnosis, someone who paid attention, the kind of person who noticed things. The verdict came through, Amani said. I know, Jinwoo told me. She was quiet for a moment. 12 years, she said. Yes. She looked at the tree. Is that enough? It was not a question with a clean answer, and they both knew it. Enough for what? For the weeks in the hospital, for the surgery, for the months of calculated diminishment, for Ariel's early arrival and the 37 days in the NICU, and the specific variety of damage that happened to a person when the structure they had believed in was used as a weapon against them. The legal system had provided an answer that was the legal system's answer, which was the only answer it was capable of providing, and it was not nothing, and it was not everything. No, he said, but it's what the law can do. She nodded. Ariel made a sound, the specific conversational sound she made when she had determined that the adults around her had been quiet long enough and she had opinions she wished to register. She was developing, at 3 months, a personality that was already legible, opinionated, alert, deeply interested in faces, and possessed of an extremely clear sense of when she was not being given sufficient attention. Amani looked down at her. I know, she said to Ariel. We're having a conversation. Ariel looked at her with the expression that said this explanation was acknowledged, and the timeline for its resolution should be short. Seojun looked at his daughter's face. He looked at it the way he had been looking at it since she came home from the hospital, with the specific quality of attention he was learning to bring to things he wanted to understand rather than manage, things that deserved to be seen rather than assessed. He had been relearning this quality of attention for months, with difficulty, because he had spent 20 years developing the opposite habit. And habits at that depth of installation did not reverse quickly or cleanly, but he was learning. She has your expressions, he said. She has your jaw, Amani said. Nobody wants that. Amani looked at him. Something shifted in her face, small, brief, the particular movement of a person who was not yet ready to be consistently warmed by him, but had encountered something that overrode the not yet ready. It was not a smile. It was the precursor to a smile, the preparation of the facial muscles for something that had not yet decided to complete itself. It was enough. He looked back at the tree. "I want to tell you something," he said, "and I want to do it without it being a negotiation or an apology or a request for anything in return." She waited. He had been preparing this, not scripting it, not rehearsing it in the mirror the way his organization's media team scripted public statements, but working it out in the slow, iterative way he had been working out most things since New Orleans, by letting the thoughts exist until they found their own shape. "I understand now what you were building here," he said. "Not the building. The building I understood from the beginning, the architecture, the structural logic, the way you thought about old materials and what they could still carry. That I understood." He paused. "What I didn't understand was what you were building with me. The kind of trust that doesn't ask for evidence. The kind of loyalty that holds even when it's not being held in return." He looked at the courtyard, at everything her hands had made out of it. "I couldn't understand it because I had never been offered it before without a price attached. And I decided the price must be hidden, and I spent 18 months looking for it." She was very still beside him. "There was no price," he said. You were just loving me. That was the whole thing. And I didn't know what to do with something that didn't have terms." Ariel had gone quiet. She was looking at the tree, or at the light in the tree, or at whatever infants perceived when they looked at something with that quality of undivided absorption. "I know," Imani said. Her voice was very quiet. "I know you know," he said. "I'm not telling you because I think you need to hear it. I'm telling you because I need you to know, that I finally, completely know." He paused. "I knew it in pieces before, but pieces aren't the same as the whole thing." She looked at him. He looked back. The spring light was doing what spring light did in this courtyard, coming in at the angle that cleared the eastern wall and hit the persimmon tree from the side, the light his father had planted the tree into, the same light that would be here in 20 years and 40 years, and however many years this house stood in this spot, with this tree at its center. "I'm not ready to call it fixed," she said. "I know. I'm not going to pretend it's fixed when it isn't, because pretending would make it worse. The pretending is what breaks things further." She looked at Ariel, then back at him. "But I'm here. I'm in this house. And I'm telling you that's a choice I make every morning. Not a default. Not a convenience. A choice." "I know," he said. For the third time. The same words, doing different work each time he said them. "Stop saying I know," she said. "Say something else." He thought about it. "Thank you for choosing it," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at the tree. They stood together in the courtyard of Woolream House and did not speak. And Ariel looked at the new growth on the persimmon branches with her total absorptive attention, and the light moved across the stones of the courtyard the way light had been moving across them for a very long time. What? The press conference happened 5 months after the New Orleans filing. It was Seojun's idea, and his insistence and his composition. He had written the statement himself, had refused the version his communications team prepared, had sat with Jin Woo for 3 hours rewriting it until it said exactly what he meant rather than what was advisable. He stood behind the podium in the Kang organization's official conference room with cameras from 12 outlets and the knowledge that the footage would be archived permanently and would follow his public record for as long as there was a public record. He did not have notes. He had memorized it, not because it was a performance, but because reading from paper created a distance between speaker and statement that he was not willing to create for this particular statement. He said, "My wife, Imani Cross Kang, spent 18 months inside this organization's projects, identifying a criminal conspiracy that was draining our funds, corrupting our legitimate operations, and positioning fabricated evidence against her to ensure she could not expose it. She did this without my knowledge, without my support, and ultimately without my trust. Because I failed to extend to her the trust she had earned and continued to earn in the period when I withdrew it. She was removed from this country based on evidence I now know was deliberately manufactured to deceive me. I signed the document authorizing her removal. I did this because I was deceived, And I did this because my pride allowed me to be deceived, and the distinction between those two causes matters to me because the second one is mine to own." He paused. Amani Cross Kang is one of the most accomplished restoration architects working in East Asia. She is the founding authority of the Walrim Cultural Foundation. She is the mother of my daughter, and she is a woman who chose, while being investigated as a criminal, to protect members of my family from truths she believed would damage them. He looked at the cameras. She was right about the truths and wrong about the protection. The truths came out regardless. And what remained on the other side of them was a woman whose integrity had survived everything this organization and its enemies and its internal rot threw at her. He placed his hands flat on the podium. I am not making this statement to repair my reputation. I am making it because the public record contained false information about my wife that was placed there by criminal actors and amplified by every media outlet in this room. The correction requires the same amplification. I am also making it to say, in the clearest language available to me, that what happened to Amani Cross was not a mistake or an accident or an error of judgment that could not have been avoided. It was the consequence of a system inside this organization and inside myself that valued power over truth and control over trust. That system failed the most important person in my life at the worst possible moment. Addressing it is my responsibility and my project for as long as it takes. He stepped back from the podium. He did not take questions. Jin Woo was waiting at the side of the room. They walked out together, and Jin Woo said nothing until they were in the elevator, and then, "That was either the bravest thing you've ever done publicly or the most expensive." "Both," Seo Jun said. "Probably," Jin Woo agreed. Imani watched the footage that evening from the Walrim House residence apartment, sitting on the floor with Ariel in her lap, her back against the couch, the laptop balanced on her knees. She watched it twice. She did not fast forward through any of it. When it finished the second time, she sat for a moment with her hand on Ariel's back and the laptop screen dimming towards sleep, and the sound of the Walrim House courtyard coming through the open window, the wind in the persimmon tree, the specific sound of old wood and stone settling in the cool of the evening. She closed the laptop. She picked up her phone and sent a text to Seo Jun. It said, "The statement was good." 3 words. She stared at them for a moment after sending, thinking about whether they were enough. Then she decided they were what she had and sent nothing else. His reply came in 40 seconds. It said, "It was true. That's all it was." She looked at this. She put her phone face down on the floor beside her and held her daughter and listened to the courtyard and let the evening be what it was. Madame Kang Hyeon resigned from every position in the Kang organization on a Monday in late spring in a written statement delivered by her attorney and containing no expression of remorse and no acknowledgement of wrongdoing beyond what the cooperation agreement technically required. Seo Jun read the statement. He did not respond to it publicly. He went to see her once, 2 months after her cooperation agreement was finalized, in the family mansion that she continued to occupy pending the outcome of her own legal process. He went alone, without Jin Woo, without the documents that had been spread across her dining table the last time he'd stood in this house. She was in the garden when he arrived. The garden was the part of the property she had always managed with personal attention, had never delegated to the groundskeeper the specific decisions about what grew where, had a lifelong preference for structured plantings over natural disorder. He sat across from her at the garden table. She looked at him with the same composed attention she had always brought to difficult conversations. The composure was intact. It would, he suspected, always be intact. It was too deeply embedded to be undone by even what had happened. It was part of the architecture of who she was at a level that experience could not fully reach. "How is the child?" she said. "She's well," he said. "She's growing quickly. She has very definite opinions for a 4-month-old. Something moved in his mother's face. Not warmth. Warmth was not the register she operated in, but something adjacent to it. The expression of a woman acknowledging the existence of something she did not have access to and was not going to ask for access to. "And Amani," she said. "Working," he said. "The Walrim Foundation is beginning a second restoration project. She's been approached by a heritage organization in Gyeongju." He paused. "She's well." His mother looked at her hands on the garden table. I would not have predicted this outcome, she said. I know. I predicted she would leave. I believe that removing the immediate threat, the pregnancy, the legal residency, the proximity to your operations, would allow the situation to resolve naturally. She paused. I did not predict that she would survive what I authorized, recover, and return to become more central to your life than she was before. He looked at her. You should have, he said. You should have predicted it because I told you from the beginning what she was. I told you she was not someone who left when things became difficult. I told you that choosing her when the world judged her would be hard, and that I intended to do it. He paused. And then I failed to do it, which encouraged you to believe your prediction was correct. That's on me. His mother said nothing. I'm not going to ask you to apologize, he said. I know what that would produce and what it would cost both of us, and I don't think the cost is worth what would come from it. He looked at the garden, at the ordered plantings, the structures she had spent decades maintaining. I'm asking something different. I'm asking you to understand that Ariel is going to know her grandmother, or not know her, based entirely on what you choose to build in the time you have. Not what you were, what you choose to build. She looked at him. I have never asked Amani for anything, he said. I'm not asking her to include you, but I'm not excluding you either. That's as far as I'm able to go. She was quiet for a long time. You are very like your father, she said finally. Her voice had something in it that was unfamiliar, a roughness that did not come from the legal process, or from the publicity, or from any external event, but from somewhere older and more interior. He was the only person who ever made me uncertain whether I was doing the right thing. He held her gaze. Were you, he said, ever certain? She looked at her hands. No, she said. I was determined. Those are different things. He sat with this. I know, he said. He stayed for another hour. They talked about the garden, about the legal timeline, about a cousin who had had a child that spring. They did not talk about Amani or the airport or the documents or the recording. Those things were present anyway, the way the past was always present in a room between two people who shared it, but they did not require speech. When he left, she walked him to the gate. She did not embrace him. She had never been a woman who expressed things through physical contact, and this was not the moment that would change that. She stood at the gate and looked at him with the assessment that had been looking at him his entire life. Bring her sometime, she said. The child. He looked at her. I'll talk to Amani, he said. He walked to the car. The Woolroom Cultural Foundation's first public event was held in late summer, 6 months after Ariel came home from the NICU. It was not a gala, not a black tie reception for the kind of investors and partners who expected their attendance at cultural events to be treated as a performance of refinement. It was an open day. The building's restored spaces accessible to any member of the public who wanted to walk through them, guided by architecture students from 3 Seoul universities who had worked on the project's documentation, with a display in the main pavilion of the original construction records, the restoration photographs, and the architectural drawings that had tracked the project from first survey to completion. Amani had organized every element of it herself. She stood in the restored pavilion that afternoon, Ariel in the carrier on her chest, talking to a student who was asking questions about the internal framing of the western wall, with the specific intensity of someone who had chosen their life's work and was in the presence of an example of it done exceptionally. Amani answered everything, not with the compressed patience of a person doing an obligation, but with the genuine attention of someone who had not yet stopped finding her own work interesting, which was, she had learned from the best architects she'd ever encountered, the quality that separated the ones who lasted from the ones who didn't. Seo-jun was at the entrance, talking to Director Park about the foundation's governance structure. Not running the event, he had no role in running the event, which was Amani's domain and had been established as Amani's domain legally and operationally, and he had not suggested otherwise. He was there as a guest of the foundation, same as the architecture students and the heritage organization representatives, and the 2 journalists who had been invited to document the space. He watched her across the pavilion. He watched her the way he had watched her the first time they stood in this courtyard together. The 2 of them arguing about a wall, neither of them knowing yet what was beginning. She had the same quality now that she'd had then, the quality of a person entirely in possession of themselves, whose intelligence and stubbornness and warmth existed in a combination that was hers specifically, that could not be replicated or managed or redirected, that was simply what she was and had always been. Ariel from the carrier was watching the pavilion ceiling with her absorptive 4-month attention. The restored ceiling beams, the light coming through the repaired roof panels, the extraordinary quality of old wood in afternoon light. She made the conversational sound. Amani looked down at her. "I know," she said. "It's beautiful." Later, when the last of the visitors had gone, and the students were packing up their documentation materials, and the late afternoon light was doing what it did in the Woolream House courtyard in August, going golden and amber and long, the shadows of the persimmon tree stretching across the stones, Imani came and stood beside Seojun near the gate. They stood together and looked at the courtyard. Ariel had fallen asleep in the carrier, her head tipped to one side, her hands open, the reaching finally stilled into the deep, uncomplicated rest of the very young. "It worked," Imani said. "It worked," he agreed. "The West Wing is going to need additional climate control before winter," she said. "The East Corridor gets cold drafts through the connection joints. I designed around the frame, but I didn't fully account for the seasonal pressure differential." "Can it be fixed?" "Everything can be fixed," she said. "It just requires understanding what you're working with." He looked at her. She was looking at the courtyard, but there was something in the way she said it, the evenness of it, the way the words held more than their structural content, that told him she was not only talking about the building. He looked at the courtyard too. The persimmon tree in the last of the afternoon light, the western wall standing intact, the pavilion with its repaired floor and its new purposes, the east corridor with its imperfect joints and its drafts that could be addressed with attention and time. "I know you're not ready to call it fixed," he said. "No?" She shifted Ariel slightly in the carrier, adjusting the weight with the practiced ease of 2 months of carrying her. "But I'm here. And tomorrow I'll be here. And the day after." She paused. "That's what I have. Showing up. Every day." "That's everything," he said. She looked at him for a moment, not the measuring look, not the assessing look. The older look, the one that had been there before the airport, that had survived the airport, that was still there now on the other side of everything, and was perhaps, of all the things that had survived, the most remarkable. "Don't waste it," she said. "I won't," he said. She turned and walked back into the pavilion to help the last of the students. He stood at the gate of Woolream House and watched her go, watched the woman who had stood in front of an excavator and refused to move, who had carried 7 months of evidence alone, who had placed a brass key on an airport floor and walked through a security gate without looking back, who had reached her hand through an incubator portal in a hospital in New Orleans and held on to the smallest, most insistent thing either of them had ever made. He watched her until she was inside. Then he looked at the persimmon tree, the branches full now with late summer growth, the leaves dense and dark green, the first small hints of autumn color beginning at the edges of the oldest leaves where the season was making itself known. His father had planted it the year his brother was born. Imani had built this place around it, and Ariel, asleep against her mother's chest inside the oldest room in the building, would grow up knowing both of those facts, would know where the tree came from and what it had cost to keep it, and what kind of person had decided it was worth the cost. She would make her own assessment. He was not afraid of it. He walked back into the courtyard and closed the gate behind him, and the old iron latch, restored, patient, exactly what it had always been, clicked into place with the clean, final sound of something that knew its purpose and was doing it.